Fruit smoothie. Fucking amazing.
Johnson had to make sure that his background was very clean. In addition, after Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, he also started an investigation. He began talking to witnesses. Johnson's sister had to go. The official story is that Josepha died of a cerebral hemorrhage on December 25, 1961, and was found in her bed. Despite state law, no autopsy was conducted, so how could they know the cause of death? 23 years later, the lawyer, Douglas Caddy, wrote to Stephen S. Trott at the U.S. Department of Justice. In the letter, Caddy claimed that Billy Sol Estes, Lyndon B. Johnson, Mac Wallace, and Cliff Carter had been involved in the murders of several people, including Josepha Johnson and John Kinzer. Kennedy won his unquestionable close election against Vice President Richard M. Nixon due to reported widespread fraud and vote buying by his father, former Prohibition bootlegger and U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain Joseph Kennedy Sr., who recruited his mafia friends through mob boss Sam Giancana in major cities like Chicago to bundle ballots and coerce voters. But LBJ had more problems. As the new Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy was already investigating Johnson and his associates for a multitude of crimes, and they had Democrat support in Congress from members who hated Johnson. These investigations went away after JFK was killed. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was shot and killed while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Johnson was then sworn in as president later that day aboard Air Force One. It has always been assumed, and at least one member of the Warren Commission believed, that LBJ was behind the hit because he hated Kennedy and because of the investigations into his criminal activities. Defeating Republican candidate Barry Goldwater by more than 15 million votes in the 1964 presidential election, Johnson introduced a slate of new reforms that he said would build a great society for all Americans. Johnson was looking to run for re-election, and he needed to have secure black votes not yet convinced by his getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed through the House of Representatives, approved with bipartisan support by a vote of 290 to 130. All Republicans and only a few Democrats voted for the bill. This was later revised in 1968 to aid Native Americans. But the bill had to pass the Senate, and Johnson needed Republican support because his fellow Democrats were not on board. The bill then moved to the U.S. Senate, where Southern and border state Democrats staged a 75-day filibuster against it. This was one of the longest filibusters in U.S. history, and Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, a former Ku Klux Klan member, spoke for over 14 consecutive hours, arguing against civil rights for blacks. The Republican majority passed it in the Senate. The law prohibited racial segregation and discrimination in places of public accommodation, discrimination by race or sex in employment and union membership, and new guarantees of equal voting rights. The Department of Justice could bring lawsuits against local school boards to end discrimination, leading to desegregation. The constitutionality of the law was immediately challenged by Democrats, but it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1964. Johnson decided to begin working on his Great Society program to ensure that black Americans would have a good reason to vote for Democrats in the future. His plan was to have American taxpayer money dispersed primarily among the black community in particular, but also poor whites, who were all generally impoverished and less educated. However, the expansion of government and a strategy focused on handouts that discouraged self-improvement caused more harm than good, and it did not help the poor. 5 decades later, after President Johnson initiated the war on poverty, America remained at around the same percentage of people still living in poverty as it did back then. In 1964, the poverty rate was approximately 19%. Today, it's around 15%, said Project 21 spokesman Derek Green in 2014. Statistics such as these demonstrate the war on poverty was a continually mismanaged disaster. That isn't to say there haven't been people helped by it. All things considered, however, it's been a tragedy. Green then added, "The disastrous effects of the government's management of anti-poverty initiatives are recognizable across racial lines, but the destruction is particularly evident in the black community. It effectively subsidized the dissolution of the black family by rendering the black man's role as a husband and father irrelevant invisible, and more specifically, disposable. The result has been several generations of black born into broken homes and broken communities, experiencing social, moral, and economic chaos. It fosters an inescapable dependency that primarily and oftentimes solely relies on government to sustain livelihoods. Federal programs directly resulting from the war on poverty include Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, food stamps, and enhanced Social Security benefits. At the time, President Johnson boasted the richest nation on earth can afford to win it. The result was a complete failure, creating generational poverty with trillions of dollars spent over the last 60 years on a failed application of socialism which still reverberates today. Next, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, but again the Voting Rights Bill was passed in the U.S. Senate by a 77-19 vote, with Democrats voting no in their majority.
I like it.
On May 26, 1965, after debating the bill for more than a month,
wow,
the U.S. House of Representatives.
So you can fan the hammer exactly like McCassie. Remember McCassie from what's it called? Overwatch. There was no ADS. Pretty cool. I'm gonna make a tool chest. Oh no, I have a tool chest. I'm gonna put a tool chest over here. Ooh, I'm almost to another mining ship now.
Representatives passed the bill by a vote of 333 to 85. No Democrats on July 9th. Despite Johnson's ego and disinterest in people in general, he did manage to do some other things that did help Americans, but they were all for political optics. Johnson signed the Social Security Amendments Act of 1965 into law, creating Medicare and Medicaid. Johnson followed JFK's position of supporting NASA and made the Apollo program a national priority. In 1967, he nominated black civil rights lawyer Thurgood Marshall to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was a good decision, but not altruistic by any means. On October 22, 1968, Johnson passed the Gun Control Act, which satisfied the anti-gun lobby. The race riots in 1966 and deaths of JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King Jr. prompted the action. However, insiders who knew him stated that Johnson's reasons for getting the law passed was to restrict access to guns by minorities, mostly blacks, due to the riots by creating more regulations and stringent purchasing and registration requirements. However, Lyndon Johnson's hypocrisy knew no bounds. when he stated publicly that he would not send American boys to do what South Vietnamese boys should be doing for themselves, rang hollow. Here's why. Johnson's family, along with Secretary of Defense Robert Strange McNamara, were heavily invested in the military industry. Johnson and his wife were investors in Bell Aircraft that made the UH-1 Iroquois Huey helicopter, among others. McNamara owned massive stock in Ford Motor Company, making military vehicles, and many others on Capitol Hill were big investors in the war industry. Johnson's great break came when he created the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and the resolution was passed in Congress on August 7th. Johnson had just brought the United States officially into a war that would last until 1975. Investment portfolios exploded as the war industry went full throttle to supply the military. Johnson, McNamara, and others made a lot of money. He and his wife also owned several radio and TV stations, as well as Lady Bird Manufacturing Company, and they produced ammunition, which they sold to arms globally, dealers, salesmen, and then it was reported that they even sold it to the North Vietnamese to kill our men. That is probably true, but it came through third parties. According to some detractors, this is one of the many reasons why he wanted the war to continue. It has been assumed that he got kickbacks from all the other large manufacturers who made so much money from the war. Johnson had also invested in several companies such as Day and Zimmerman, who had the construction contracts to build air bases such as the U.S. Air Force Base in Korat, Thailand, among others used during the war. When Johnson died on January 22, 1973, he was worth an amazing $100 million in 1973 money, almost $900 million in 2023 value. In later years, more investigations continued. On August 9, 1984, Estes' lawyer, Douglas Caddy, wrote to Stephen S. Trott at the U.S. Department of Justice. In his letter to Trott, he stated, Mr. Estes is willing to testify that LBJ ordered these killings and that he transmitted his orders through Cliff Carter to Mac Wallace, who executed the murders. Mr. Estes was a member of a 4-member group headed by Lyndon Johnson, which committed criminal acts in Texas in the 1960s. The other two, besides Mr. Estes and LBJ, were Cliff Carter and Mac Wallace. Mr. Estes is willing to disclose his knowledge concerning the following criminal offenses. 1. The killing of Henry Marshall. 2. The killing of George Kudelek. 3. The killing of Ike Rogers and his secretary. 4. The killing of Harold Orr. 5. The killing of Coleman Wade. 6. The killing of Josepha Johnson. 7. The killing of John Kinzer. 8. The killing of President J.F. Kennedy. In the cases of murders numbers 1 through 7, Mr. Estes' knowledge of the precise details concerning the way the murders were executed stems from conversation he had shortly after each event with Cliff Carter and Mac Wallace. In addition, a short time after Mr. Estes was released from prison in 1971, he met with Cliff Carter and they reminisced about what had occurred in the past, including the murders. During their conversation, Carter orally compiled a list of 17 murders which had been committed, some of which Mr. Estes was unfamiliar. A living witness was present at the meeting and should be willing to testify about it. He is Kyle Brown, recently of Houston and now living in Brady, Texas. Mr. Estes states that Mac Wallace, whom he describes as a stone killer with a communist background, recruited Jack Ruby, who in turn recruited Lee Harvey Oswald. Strangely, Wallace himself was killed in a suspicious automobile accident in 1971. Resuming quote, Mr. Estes says that the Mafia did not participate in the Kennedy assassination, but that its participation was discussed prior to the event but rejected by LBJ, who believed if the Mafia were involved, he would never be out from under its blackmail. On June 19, 1992, former Texas Ranger and U.S. Marshal Clint Peoples told a friend that he had documented evidence that LBJ's associate, Mac Wallace, was one of the shooters in Dealey Plaza during the Kennedy assassination. More information was coming. He apparently had information on the 18 material witnesses to the JFK shooting who had all died within 3 years of the event. The London Times calculated the likelihood of all 18 witnesses of their respective ages dying of any cause within 3 years of JFK's assassination as 1 in 100 trillion. This testimony regarding Wallace would have been an SD sealed testimony given before a Robertson County grand jury in 1984, which Peoples had. On June 23, 1992, Peoples was killed in a mysterious one-car automobile accident in Texas. U.S. Air Force General Curtis E. LeMay stated that Johnson never did anything to benefit anyone in society, laws or otherwise, unless it benefited himself politically. He also stated during my personal interview with him in 1986 that the only reason Johnson pushed to get welfare passed was to secure the black vote for Democrats forever. On another note, Madeline Duncan Brown, Johnson's alleged longtime mistress of 20 years, and who died in 2002, claimed that her son Stephen was born out of that relationship, and she also implicated Johnson in the conspiracy to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. Both claims were never proven, as witnesses were dead. Regarding Mac Wallace and LBJ's connection to the JFK assassination, on March 12, 1998, Wallace's fingerprint, as was recorded in 1951 when he was arrested, was positively matched with a copy of a fingerprint labeled unknown that investigators lifted on November 22, 1963, from a shipping carton located near the southeast side of the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository building. That was where Oswald was supposed to have shot Kennedy. The carton, labeled Box A, also contained several fingerprints identified as those of Lee Harvey Oswald. So, we leave it up to you. Who was the worst president? Well, you have several to choose from. Thank you for watching.
Former United States
Thank you,
President
the Real
George
News Network. I'd
H.W.
like to sub
Bush
your channel.
died on November 30th, 2018. And while leading Democrats joined the GOP in celebrating the Republican leader as a hero, honoring him in a bipartisan ceremony, the real Bush left behind a murderous legacy full of war crimes across the planet. The corporate media lionized Bush, a former oil tycoon and director of the CIA, as a statesman who committed his life to his country. But Bush's patriotism was not rooted in devotion to the average working-class American people. Instead, he was an elite custodian of capitalism and empire. From Iraq to Panama, George H.W. Bush was responsible for countless deaths. And far from being the moderate voice of reason he is now being presented as in the era of Trumpism, Bush paved the way for right-wing extremists to take control of the U.S. empire he so carefully preserved. If one had to succinctly summarize George H.W. Bush in a single moment, it would be in the eve of his presidency in 1988. On July 3rd of that year, the U.S. government shot down an Iranian civilian plane, killing all 290 passengers on board, including 66 children. The United States adamantly refused to apologize for this horrific atrocity. Bush was then vice president under Ronald Reagan and was in the middle of his own campaign for president. At a GOP event just a month later, in August, Bush indirectly responded to the U.S. massacre of Iranian civilians with the following infamous words.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
This lone quote says so much about the 41st U.S. president. It is a concise representation of the imperial hubris and chauvinism that Bush was the physical embodiment of. He refused to apologize for the crimes of the U.S. empire and did not give a damn about the facts. George H.W. Bush's family, life, and world were the textbook representation of the American ruling class, combining together the CIA, the oil industry, elite Ivy League universities, and even Nazi Germany. Bush was born in 1924 into an elite capitalist family. His grandfather, Samuel Bush, was a corporate steel and railroad executive who oversaw U.S. government contracts with weapons corporations during World War I. H.W.'s father, Prescott Bush, was an even more notorious figure. In 1918, as a member of Yale University's elite secret society Skull and Bones, Prescott and his peers dug up the grave of former Native American leader Geronimo and stole his skull. Prescott Bush then went on to become a bank executive on Wall Street. And during the Holocaust, the Bush family patriarch even profited from the genocidal Hitler regime. As the newspaper The Guardian reported in 2004, even after America had entered the war and when there was already significant information about the Nazis' plans and policies, he worked for and profited from companies closely involved with the very German businesses that financed Hitler's rise to power. It has also been suggested that the money he made from these dealings helped to establish the Bush family fortune and set up its political dynasty. Although the assets of Prescott Bush's company were seized by the U.S. government in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act, this did not stop him from pursuing a political career. A decade later, in 1952, Bush was elected to the U.S. Senate, representing Connecticut. George H.W. Bush followed in the footsteps of his father. He went to Yale University and was also a member of the elite secret society Skull and Bones. After graduation, Bush moved to Texas and entered the oil industry. In 1953, he co-founded the Zapata Petroleum Corporation and quickly became a millionaire. In the early 1960s, before Bush officially entered politics, he also secretly started to work with the CIA. Journalist Joseph McBride noted, quote, Bush started working for the agency in 1960 or 1961, using his oil business as a cover for clandestine activities. After over a
Fucking
decade
spy.
of building up his fortune in the oil industry, Bush then moved on to politics. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1966, representing Texas. But that was just the beginning. Bush then became U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and subsequently chairman of the Republican National Committee. And then in 1976, Bush was appointed Director of Central Intelligence. After secretly working with the CIA for over a decade, Bush, a staunchly conservative Cold Warrior, was now the chief of it. Historian Greg Grandin wrote, quote, Bush helmed the CIA when it was working closely with Latin American death squads grouped under Operation Condor. This was the height of the Cold War, and after the CIA had already violently overthrown numerous democratically elected governments throughout the global south, from Iran to Guatemala to Chile, the U.S. continued supporting far-right military dictatorships and death squads throughout Latin America. This was also at a time when Bush was developing deeper ties to Saudi Arabia, one of the world's largest oil producers and a key U.S. ally in the Cold War. With U.S. backing, the Saudi monarchy supported right-wing Islamist groups, many of which were extremists, to undermine secular socialist and communist forces in the Middle East. And through both oil and politics, Bush and his family maintained close links to Saudi elites, including the powerful bin Laden family. Historian Greg Grandin likewise pointed out that it was Bush who helped facilitate Ronald Reagan's escalation of the Cold War through the infamous Iran-Contra scandal. Bush served as vice president under President Reagan during this scandal, in which the Republican administration sold weapons to Iran in order to fund far-right Contra death squads in Nicaragua. When Bush succeeded Reagan as the 41st president, he used his authority to pardon the conspirators involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, thereby preventing an investigation into his own criminal activity. Many observers have noted that by doing this, George H.W. Bush helped set the precedent that Donald Trump would later exploit as president. But this paled in comparison to Bush's most egregious crimes. In 1989, the administration of the newly inaugurated President Bush invaded the tiny Central American nation of Panama in order to oust dictator Manuel Noriega who had himself been a longtime CIA asset, who for years worked closely with the United States, helping it to fund right-wing death squads while it was trafficking drugs. The U.S. brutally bombed Panama, burning down thousands of homes, leading to the nickname Little Hiroshima. Historian Greg Grandin noted that the bodies of dead Panamanians were shoveled into mass graves. But Bush's bloodiest atrocities were yet to come. In August 1990, Iraq militarily occupied and annexed its southern neighbor Kuwait. The Bush administration wanted a war in response, and in order to sell this war, it spread blatant lies. In October 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl testified before the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus and claimed,
"While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor." That was horrifying.
Human rights organizations like Amnesty International obediently echoed this myth, and George H.W. Bush used it to justify a war on Iraq.
We had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
It was only after this war, in 1992, that it was revealed that this 15-year-old girl was actually the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S., and that the lies she spread had been orchestrated by a PR firm on behalf of the Kuwaiti monarchy. But remember, Bush had declared just a few years ago that he didn't care what the facts were. In 1991, the 41st U.S. president launched a war on Iraq, and it was extremely brutal. Under Bush's leadership, the U.S. military deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, devastating the country. Just weeks after the end of the war, the United Nations published a survey analyzing the civilian damage done by U.S. bombing. The UN found that Iraq was, quote, near apocalyptic, that it had been bombed back, quote, to a pre-industrial age, and that the country was on the verge of a, quote, epidemic and famine. The U.S. military also used depleted uranium weapons in Iraq, leading to birth defects, high cancer rates, and environmental damage that Iraqis are still suffering from to this day. Even the Washington Post, which supported the war, acknowledged 4 months after it that the U.S. and its allies, quote, sought to achieve some of their military objectives in the Persian Gulf War by disabling Iraqi society at large. And the U.S., quote, deliberately did
Please stop,
harm
please stop,
to Iraq's
please stop,
ability
please
to
stop,
support
please
itself
stop, please stop,
as an industrial
please stop.
society. Precision-guided weapons were used to specifically target electrical plants, oil refineries, and the transportation grid. The U.S. destroyed more than 100 bridges, along with roads, railroads, factories, phone networks, and TV and radio stations. The Pentagon later admitted that it intentionally demolished Iraq's electricity infrastructure, reducing the country's power generation level after the war by 96%, knocking it back to the level that Iraq had in 1920. A lieutenant general told the Washington Post that the psychological impacts that average Iraqi citizens would suffer from after losing their electricity was a, quote, side benefit. One of the most extreme U.S. crimes was committed on February 13, 1991, when the military used laser-guided smart bombs to destroy a shelter full of civilians. 408 Iraqi civilians were massacred in this U.S. attack, and the Pentagon itself admitted that the Amaria shelter that it bombed was being used by civilians seeking protection. Even more blood-curdling was an atrocity that was so heinous it earned the name the Highway of Death. On February 26th and 27th, the U.S. and allies Britain, France, and Canada bombed Iraqi soldiers as they tried to flee Kuwait and return to Iraq. Thousands of fleeing Iraqis were massacred. There were even reportedly some civilians among the soldiers as they tried to flee, including foreign workers and Palestinians who were expelled by the Kuwaiti monarchy. They were all bombed to pieces. Thousands died, The exact number of victims is unknown. The aftermath of the Gulf War was beyond catastrophic. A Harvard public health team investigated and found that Iraq had acute malnutrition and epidemic levels of the preventable diseases cholera and typhoid. The Harvard team also estimated that at least 170,000 Iraqi children under age 5 would die in the year after the war due to the effects of the U.S. bombing. The Washington Post noted, quote, "Planners now say their intent was to destroy or damage valuable facilities that Baghdad could not repair without foreign assistance." The Bush administration deliberately made the lives of millions of Iraqis complete hell to try to force them into such desperation that they would overthrow their leader. And even when the 1991 Gulf War ended, the Bush 41 administration's war on Iraqi society continued. The U.S. used the United Nations Security Council to expand crippling sanctions on Iraq, which banned all trade with the country. These sanctions, which were further continued under subsequent President Bill Clinton, led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children and other civilians. In response to these reports of mass civilian devastation from U.S. bombing, George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, insisted that every target was, quote, perfectly legitimate. He declared, quote, "If I had to do it over again, I would do exactly the same thing." Bush Sr.'s Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney would go on to become Bush Jr.'s vice president, and the brains behind George W. Bush's foreign policy and his own second war on Iraq a decade later. Moreover, H.W. Bush's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, later served as W. Bush's Secretary of State. Given the overlap between Bush 41's administration and that of Bush 43, it is no surprise that Bush Jr. followed in his father's footsteps, launching another devastating war in the Middle East, which destabilized the region and led to more than 1 million deaths. These crimes fly directly in the face of the corporate media's portrayal of George H.W. Bush as a principled moderate, and expose the cynicism behind the attempts to distance him from the political horrors that followed. While Google made a doodle dedicated to H.W.'s passing, and while neoliberal centrist leaders of the Democratic Party tried to rehabilitate Bush as a resistance figure against Donald Trump, the reality is that he and the Bush family only helped set the stage for the rise of far-right Trumpism. Even the explicit racism and the dog-whistling to fascists and white supremacists that Donald Trump has weaponized is far from new. H.W. engaged in it as well. During his 1988 campaign for president, Bush and his supporters resorted to using racist undertones to attack his Democratic opponent, Michael Dukakis. Specifically, they exploited the case of Willie Horton, a black man who was imprisoned for murder and rape, but who escaped from prison after being temporarily released on a weekend furlough program in Massachusetts. Far-right writer Ann Coulter, a staunch Donald Trump supporter who regularly contributes to white supremacist website, described the H.W. camp's racist exploitation of the Willie Horton scandal as, quote, Bush's finest 30 seconds. Journalist Russ Bellunt, the author of the book Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Republican Party, also documented how former Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe helped get Bush elected president. Fascist, staunch anti-communists who immigrated to the U.S. from socialist Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War later took leadership positions in the Republican National Committee's ethnic outreach groups and strongly supported Bush. A lifelong Cold Warrior, Bush was also president when U.S.-backed counter-revolutions overthrew the Eastern Bloc in 1990 and 1991. He subsequently helped oversee brutal neoliberal capitalist reforms that were referred to as shock therapy, and that led to millions of unnecessary deaths in the former Soviet Union. Under Bush's leadership, the U.S. pressured these former socialist governments to engage in mass privatizations, selling off state-owned industries and assets for pennies on the dollar. This U.S.-backed neoliberal shock therapy established the network of capitalist oligarchs who control Eastern Europe still today. This was just one of the many policies that George H.W. Bush oversaw that the world is still reeling in 2018. It was not just war crimes and CIA spying, oil drilling, and racist dog whistling that defined Bush's life. In 1990, the 41st U.S. president heralded in what he proudly called a new world order. Capitalism had won the global war on socialism, and Bush was the leader of the only remaining superpower in the world. The United States of America was the global hegemon, and its military and corporations ruled all. American imperialism had triumphed and would spend the next 3 decades imposing the Washington Consensus on the planet. In this way, George H.W. Bush did much more than just pave the way for his son and eventually Donald Trump to take power. Even more importantly, as Bush stood there with the last Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev, Bush was being anointed king of the neoliberal era, the seeds of which had been planted by his predecessor Ronald Reagan. That neoliberal era died in 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, the resurgence of far-right and fascist movements across the globe, and with the renewed socialist left and the implosion of the bipartisan centrist consensus. After his passing, Bush was commemorated as a skilled leader, and he was indeed skilled in the art of empire, warmongering, and reaction. Bush was the last competent manager of the American ruling class. He came from the elite, from the rich and powerful, and he left them even richer on his deathbed. Bush was a lifelong custodian of U.S. imperialism and capitalism, and he served those systems well. He bears significant responsibility for ushering in the new world order that followed, the one whose demons we're all grappling with today. Bush 41 supporters have tried to absolve him for the state of the country and the world that he left behind, but George H.W. Bush cannot be separated from it. After all, he refused to ever apologize to his country and cared little for inconvenient facts.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
For the Real News Network, I'm Ben Norton.
Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We're continuing our series of interviews with John Kiriakou. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And just to remind everybody, John's a former CIA officer, yes, and you'll find his whole career watch the earlier segments, because this is going to make a heck of a lot more sense that you have, because we're working our way through John's life. You left Greece back in the year 2000. We were working on Greek terrorism, and then 9/11. So, where are you, and how does it affect you?
I was at CIA headquarters that day. I was supposed to go to the White House that morning with Cofer Black, later at Jackson. Cofer, at the time, was the director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. And we had a meeting scheduled that morning with Condoleezza Rice, who at the time was the National Security Advisor, to discuss a Greek issue, which seemed pointless. But I had taken a call from a driver who said that our car was ready and to come out to the side entrance to ride to the White House.
Now, before we could do that trip, what's the mood at CIA? Because we know now, according to George Kennedy, that he had told President Bush, his presidential national security briefing, that the number one threat to the United States is Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. That summer, leading up to 9/11, Bush was fired to say that terrorism was fired. We know now that there are at least 4 or 5, and maybe quite a few more, of very specific pieces of intelligence that suggest that there was going to be an attack. In fact, it was even known some of the people that ended up on the planes that had been identified pre-9/11. There's a lot going on. I know you're working Greek style, but how much are you getting a sense of this?
Well, I mentioned this in my book. It was July the 6th, 2001. I was asked to spend a day with a visiting group of Arab intelligence officers. They came to have a day of briefings and meetings and handshakes and gift exchanges, and we did this kind of thing all the time with our foreign partners. So, as part of that day of briefings, I had asked for briefings from the Osama bin Laden group in the CIA's counterterrorism center. Much to my surprise, they did not send a mid-level analyst, which is what I had expected, to do this briefing. Topher Black himself came, and Topher at the time was the director of the CIA's counterterrorism center, what's called the Counterterrorist Center. And Topher started off this briefing by saying, and these were his exact words, he said, something terrible is going to happen. We don't know when, and we don't know where, but we know that it's something on an unprecedented scale. He said the mood in the Al-Qaeda training camp.
What was that?
We're hearing trainers speaking to their students, crying, and saying, I'll see you in paradise. We're hearing code words used to describe a major attack. The salesman is coming with vast quantities of cash. There's going to be a great soccer match, things like that. And he said, we've never seen anything like this before. Our problem is we don't know when, and we don't know exactly what the target is. He said, I beg you, if you have any sources inside Al-Qaeda, please help us. These guys were silent. I think frankly they were stunned with silence, as I was. And at the end of the day, after they had left, I went to his office to thank Topher for spending the time during the briefing. Again, this was very unusual. And I said to him, Topher, I have to ask you, was that for their benefit? Or are things really that bad? He said, things really are that bad. We're going to get hit, and it's going to be terrible.
This is July. Now we know there are various sections of the military intelligence and other areas of various intelligence agencies that were trying to model what the next tech might be.
Yes.
One of those models for military intelligence was planes hitting the Twin Towers. One of them might even fall down. We did an earlier report. Some investigative journalist, Jason Leopold, one of them, actually talked to one of the guys who was running the moon. That information, as far as I know, was expressed in a sense that it may have not made its way up the food chain, which is rather. Richard Clark published an interview just a couple of years ago, which we also had around the Real News Network, with some critical information that never made it. He said that information, in the normal course, would have made it. Someone had to intervene not to let it go up the food chain.
You have to intentionally stop it. You have to intervene and say, no, I don't want that. And I never got a report to that.
We asked Senator Bob Green specifically about this memo Osama bin Laden plans to attack the United States. But no action. Now you get a memo like that. How do you not do something?
I remember Dick Clark both saying that they were shouting this from the rooftops, and no one in the Bush White House would listen to them. You're right about the modeling. We knew from the early 1990s that Al-Qaeda was interested in using airliners as a weapon. The CIA announcement at the time was that the attack would probably be from the American embassies overseas, because they had such great success doing that.
Except when you get the memo. Right. The memorandum of bin Laden plans to attack the United States.
Well, we wrote them.
Right, we wrote them.
We wrote them.
The CIA writes the memo as a presidential briefing.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So
where did the information come from?
Which information?
That Osama bin Laden plans to attack?
All sources. The analysts were able to put that together based on these little bits of information they were able to put together. They decided that the attack was probably going to be in the United States, or at least that the intention to attack was in the United States. We didn't know that they were already here because the FBI didn't tell us.
This is the group in Seattle.
Well, they were all over the place. They were in Florida, they were in Washington, they were all over the place.
But the FBI did have knowledge of certain,
Or at least some of them.
some of them. I think the one in Seattle in particular, like an FBI informant, had two of the people.
One of the hijackers?
No.
I'm talking about the 19 hijackers.
Yeah, two of the hijackers were staying with a professor who actually had some informant kind of connection with the FBI, and the FBI didn't tell the CIA.
The FBI's relationship with the CIA at the time, and really throughout history, has been absolutely hard. We don't have us, and at
No.
least until September 11th.
Hurry up, Kate.
Probably for some time afterwards, there really was very, very little cooperation. Now, there were FBI agents, certainly, who were assigned to the CIA's counterterrorism center. And there were CIA officers assigned to the FBI's counterterrorism center. But that didn't necessarily mean that both sides were seeing all information.
You get a memorandum, you write it. You say, meaning the president gets a memorandum from the CIA. Osama bin Laden plans to attack the United States. You guys have intelligence who tells you and tells this Arab country's intelligence officers that something terrible is coming on a whole new scale. Why do you think you cannot get Condoleezza Rice to listen to the president?
So this is one of the enduring mysteries of the Bush administration. I don't know why the Bush White House was not focused solely on trying to stop this attack.
Never mind.
We all knew it was
They seem to be making efforts not to want to know.
kind of seems that.
I mean, how do you get Colleen Rowley's group in Minneapolis can't get a go to the computer of a guy that wants to learn how to take off? This is how do you get a briefing from the head of the CIA who tells you the number one problem is Al-Qaeda? You demote your anti-terrorism czar.
It's a good question.
How do you tell? Apparently, the FBI was told, don't focus on terrorism. We want you to focus on white-collar crime or something else.
There was an article just in the paper saying that the FBI is still unequipped to handle counterterrorism cases. Nobody there speaks Arabic, for example. They're still not.
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting is that, not suggesting, there seems to be actually real evidence, hard evidence. That's not a lack of focus. They were told not to focus. It's the White House. The White House is telling the FBI to deprioritize terrorism. They demote Richard, and then Richard starts screaming. You can't get their attention when his hair is on fire. I asked Bob Gray, I asked Senator Gray, well, what do you think? Is this a deliberate cult? Not know.
The fact that it was so pervasive that virtually all of the agencies of the federal government were moving in the same direction, from a customs agent at the airport in Orlando who was chastised when he denied entry in the United States to a Saudi, to the President of the United States authorizing large numbers of Saudis to leave the country, possibly denying us forever important insights and information on what happened. You don't have everybody moving in the same direction without there being a head coach somewhere who is giving them instructions as to where he wants them to move.
So that includes before and after the events?
Primarily before the event. After the event, it shifts from being an action that supports the activities of the Saudis to actions that cover up the results of that permission given to the Saudi attack.
There's got to be a coach. The coach is in the White House. He didn't say Dick Cheney, but he's not leaving much difficulty trying to understand what he's trying to say here. What do you think? Is there a deliberate leaving the back door open? And let me put one more little piece of context. We know in the Project for New American Century, this document that a lot of neocons signed in the 1990s, which called essentially for the assertion of American military power around the world to reshape the world. And it goes so far as to say international law was like useful when there was another superpower. But now it's not really so necessary anymore, international international law. We need to do the regime changes we need. But they say we'll never get the American people behind us because there's still the Vietnam syndrome, and only another galvanizing event, I may not be quoting exactly, but it's pretty close, a galvanizing event like another Pearl Harbor would create public support for this kind of a foreign policy. Then we get what seems like evidence that they don't want the agencies to know.
I don't know, to be honest with you. I can speculate. I can tell you that the war game model showing an attack with an airplane was one of hundreds of models. To be able to pick out one model and say this is the one that it's going to be, I think was probably impossible. I can tell you in the CIA, I never saw people work so hard in my entire life trying to disrupt this attack and having not enough information and nowhere near the budget necessary to really do it.
And doing it in spite of the White House, in a sense.
Yeah.
Because the White House is not listening to their own CIA director.
They're not listening, they're not cooperating, and they're not appropriate funding. Now, Dick Clark was a hero of the Clinton administration. But I think that when the George W. Bush people came into power, they saw this guy that's been in the same position for 10 years.
I don't have one
He's
with
gay,
me. Oh.
He's a liberal Democrat. It's time to give him the heave-ho.
So why not give him the heave-ho?
And they demoted him.
No. Why not give him the heave-ho and put someone else at the same level with cabinet-level access and put in somebody you like? Who, it doesn't have to be Richard
Condi
Clark.
Rice took it over. It was supposed to be Condi Rice's responsibility.
Which is
Counterterrorism.
not even listening to the people who are doing the work.
Well, that's on Condi Rice, isn't it?
Well, partly.
Yeah.
But as I'm saying, there seems to be a pattern here. It's not like it's not just some series of.
I wouldn't call it hard evidence, though, like you do. I would call it some circumstantial evidence.
Certainly enough evidence that it should be looked into, wouldn't one say?
Yeah, I would think so. Sure. But who in Congress has the balls to even take something like this up? It's just not going to happen.
No, it's not. But the media doesn't have the balls either.
Well, the media doesn't have the balls. No.
After we interviewed Bob Graham, agree or disagree, Bob Graham is an insider. Bob Graham
Absolutely.
is a serious intelligence guy.
Yes, he is. Highly respected.
After he leaves the Senate, after he writes this book saying the #1 reason to impeach George Bush is because he didn't stop 9/11, and he could have, that's in Graham's book, after he says that the Saudis are directly involved, I mean, he says all these things, and Leon Panetta appoints him to the External Advisory Committee to CIA.
Right.
Like, he's not a marginal crazy
he's a
person.
serious
right?
guy.
Serious
Right.
guy. So I do this interview with Graham, and he says all the football players running in the same direction, and we're talking about the American intelligence agencies not being able to pursue what they find is evidence of a growing plan to attack America. He says there's a coach. That's news, right? We send this out to all the news organizations up and down the United States. As a release, we offer them the footage for free. We give them a transcript of the key sections. Not a single news agency or newspaper even calls us to find out what we have.
That's the story of the mainstream media in this country. They're just not interested in deep, investigative, serious reporting.
They're not, I mean, I have to say, I think part of it is this stuff about the buildings coming down and, you know, explosives and various thermal, nuclear stuff. I think it's actually, you know, I've told people that believe this stuff, you know, if 50 years or 100 years from now you turn out to be right, I actually still think you should shut up right now. Because there's a real conspiracy, there's at least some verifiable evidence that there might have actually been a deliberate attempt to mess with the intelligence agencies and leave the back door open. There's at least enough, what's they call prima facie, to look into it. And the stuff about the building has kind of freaked everyone out so much that it seems so absurd. And even if it turns out it's true, it gets in the way of something that is actually there and verifiable.
Something important.
Well, rather important is 9/11. If the thing is, if there is a certain kind of collaboration, and if it is with the Saudis, which is what Bob Graham's committee concludes, that the Saudi government is directly involved in their words facilitating, or Graham's words, facilitating and funding, then...
See, I never saw that. I saw Saudi individuals who some of whom had ties to the Saudi government or the Saudi royal family, but I never saw this as a Saudi conspiracy.
He says so. He says the committee reached that conclusion. My own take, having interviewed quite a few people that know the Saudi governmental structure, they describe it more like a feudal structure in a sense, that there's many power centers.
Sure. Well, no. There aren't many power centers. There's one main power center, and that's the king. He's an absolute ruler. But there are influential people around the country, and their influence is based on the amount of money that they have. That's been going on since oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia.
So you can imagine that something like this can happen without coming directly from the king.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look at the bin Laden family. The bin Laden family, it's a highly respected
Bin Laden family.
Old family in Saudi Arabia, originally from Yemen. The old man bin Laden was worth billions of dollars, and it was because he was the country's greatest construction magnate, and not just for Saudi Arabia, but first all over the peninsula and then really throughout the Middle East. If you wanted something built, an airport, a port, hospitals, hotels, it was bin Laden that did it. Now, the bin Ladens have absolutely no blood ties to the royal family. They don't even have any marital ties to the royal family. But the bin Ladens are a force to be reckoned with in Saudi Arabia. I think it was people who had bin Laden kind of money who were involved in funding and financing Al-Qaeda. It wasn't necessarily the Saudi government. It wasn't necessarily even members of the Saudi royal family, although there probably were a couple of rogues. I think it was these wealthy businessmen who really keep the country humming, at least keep its non-oil economy humming. They were the ones we should have been looking at.
I have no idea who's right in this, but it is beyond belief, is it not, that there has never been an investigation.
I liked this
into what's in
dungeon
those
a
28
lot.
pages, the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional
This dungeon was
investigation.
so good.
Graham is.
This is the
Graham,
first time I've
without
enjoyed a dungeon in a
ambiguity,
long time.
Says the word government in the interview. I stress it. I say government. He says government. I said not some rogue princes or something. He says no, government. He says they have hard intelligence of that. It's in the 28 pages, and he's not allowed to say what's in the 28 pages.
I never saw any such intelligence.
Well, you weren't in that section.
But I spent most of my career working in Saudi Arabia in one way or another, and I just never saw anything like that.
Okay. All right, we're going to continue our discussion with John. We're going to pick up where he was on 9/11 and the atmosphere in CIA and his role, and he ends up in Pakistan. Please join us for the continuation of Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.
I like the Real News Network. Thank you, Real Stories. I'd like to sub to your channel.
Years with the CIA, 1964 to 1994.
I worked for the government for 35 years, starting with the Marine Corps from 1964 to 1968 with some service in Vietnam.
I was 25 years as a professional intelligence officer with CIA.
Almost 5 years in the Pentagon. In the last almost 3 of that working in the Office of Secretary of Defense.
Spent almost 20 years with the State Department, 3 years in Athens as a political counselor, the chief of the political section.
I'm a retired colonel of the United States Army, military intelligence, special forces.
I was previously with the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism from 1989 to 1993. Prior to that, I worked with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I'm a former senior estimates officer with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I started actually as a science fellow at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and became the chief scientist of the Arms Control Agency.
For 27 years was an analyst first of Soviet affairs and then of wider responsibilities.
Well, I'm a congressman representing the 30th District in Los Angeles.
I've just completed almost 3 decades of service to the United States.
Most recently, I was an Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon from 1994 to 2001.
I served for 23 years in the American Foreign Service as a diplomat.
I worked for the CIA for 28 and a half years.
I joined the agency in 1988, originally with what was then known as the National Photographic Interpretation Center.
Okay, I'm Washington editor of the Nation magazine. I've been doing that for about 16 years now.
I'm the Labour MP for a constituency in Birmingham called Birmingham Lady Ward. I've been the MP for 20 years.
For 30 years, I was a diplomat serving my country abroad. My last position, however, was as ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War.
July of 1970, the president asked me to come over to the White House Council. And I served for roughly 1,000 days until it all fell apart.
23 years as a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I came back to public service in 2001 to be the Secretary of the Army.
Spent 21 years in the CIA. Of that time, I spent 90% in the Middle East.
I'm a former weapons inspector with the United Nations in Iraq. I served in that capacity from 1991 to 1998.
I worked for the CIA for 20 years, from 1966 to 1986.
I've worked on assessing secret nuclear weapons programs for almost 20 years.
Never expected that I'd leave the Navy and become the chief spook of our country, the director of Central Intelligence, but that happened.
Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
A clear threat to the United States.
There's dozens of ballistic missiles.
It has sponsored and sheltered terrorists.
Paying suicide
Chemical
bombers.
weapons are equally chilled.
Biological weapons, including anthrax and botulism toxin.
Biological and chemical agent to kill millions of people.
Chemical weapons, including VX and sarin, mustard gas.
To a massive and sudden horror.
Massive death and destruction. Death on a massive scale.
The danger to our country is grave. The danger to our country is growing. The Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons. The Iraqi regime is building the facilities necessary to make more biological and chemical weapons. And according to the British government, the Iraqi regime could launch a biological or chemical attack in as little as 45 minutes after the order were given. The regime has long-standing and continuing ties to terrorist organizations, and there are Al-Qaeda terrorists inside Iraq. The regime is seeking a nuclear bomb, and with fissile material could build one within a year.
The Bush administration made up its mind to go to war on September the 11th, 2001.
That very first day, on September 12, one day after September 11, the meeting that was held in the White House, in the Situation Room, led to Rumsfeld asking the question, shouldn't we use this as an opportunity to do something about Iraq as well?
We all said, but no. Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan. We need to bomb Afghanistan. And Rumsfeld said, there aren't any good targets in Afghanistan. And there are lots of good targets in Iraq.
From that time on, you were dealing with rationalization and justification for the war. You weren't dealing with real causes for the war or real reasons for the war. There was never a clear and present danger. There was never an imminent threat.
With weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass death.
weapons of mass destruction was a convenient way of tricking our Congress into giving the president authority to wage this war.
Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
Develop nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons.
It was clear that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program. Over and over again, President Bush, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, particularly Vice President Cheney, but also National Security Advisor Condi Rice, drummed up the idea of a reconstituted nuclear capability, and particularly the notion that I think has some resonance among the American people of the mushroom cloud.
Leaders will use worst-case assessments that point to nuclear weapons to generate political support because they know people fear nuclear weapons so much.
The evidence was simply not there. Wolfowitz would be asked to explain, how good is the evidence? Can you tell us more about it? This is in NATO, mind you. And he'd say, well, it's like this. It's like pornography. Hard to describe, but you recognize it when you see it. My God. And we're going to go to war on that?
If someone is waiting for a so-called smoking gun, it's certain that we will have waited too long.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
So a lot of people who supported the war in Iraq actually believed that Iraq had the capability to fire missiles that could reach the United States, carrying payloads of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. Iraq has never had the capability to do that. They didn't have it in the first Gulf War. They didn't have it in this war in Iraq. And they don't have it any way of getting it in the future.
What the Bush administration did was try to round up as many people as they could who would make the case for them.
What the White House wanted was the CIA to give it talking points to justify this war. It already made up its mind.
Massive intervention by people, particularly from Vice President Cheney's office and Vice President Cheney himself in the process.
And I think the intelligence analysts found themselves really up against it when they tried to argue that those connections weren't as tight as people were saying.
The intelligence director of the Department of Energy simply ordered his experts who had raised questions about the evidence being used on the nuclear end of it to, as the news accounts say, to sit down and shut up so that the DOE would be on board with the overall estimate.
They were not given an opportunity to speak because no one wanted to hear what they said.
I was in chief of collecting information on Iraq through the mid-90s. I know what we had and what we didn't have, and I'm here to tell you there was no information.
I understand that the director himself, George Tenet, is now accompanying the briefer in the morning. And this never happened in the past. In the past, we were trusted. We were senior people. We knew what the score was. And when I hear that George Tenet is going down with the senior briefer, I wonder why.
And the very heavy leaning on the Director of Central Intelligence and his staff to produce precisely the language which would allow them to make the statements which they have been making to support the decision to go into Iraq.
Well, not only by their physical presence, but by the questions they asked, by the, well, don't you think, sort of things. Well, couldn't it be possible that?
They call this data mining, going back over old information, coming with new conclusions.
And the overwhelming opinion from the scientists of this government at the Department of Energy and even at the CIA and some of the State Department were arguing against using weapons of mass destruction as a case to go to war.
You're talking about the Vice President of the United States, and you're talking about a GS 13 or 14, a mid-level analyst in the Central Intelligence Agency. You're talking about a person who should have career protection for telling it like it is, but who knows that his chief, the director of CIA, is a member of the team, A lot of pressure on that. Shouldn't happen.
The whole purpose of the CIA was to leave those people out of Langley. That's why they're not in Washington. They're in Northern Virginia, away from the White House, away from Congress. Leave them alone, ask them what they think, but don't tell them to rethink their positions. Because then you come up with nonsense, like we saw.
The administration had decided very early on that Saddam should go, and that in itself is not a bad goal. But of course, everything depends on how you do it, when, how, where, with whom, etc.
Preemptive war by its very nature is something that is entirely new to the United States of America and to what we call the old Western Alliance. You go back through history and at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, a group of nations that had just killed most of each other off decided that this isn't quite the way to do it, and they came up with a set of laws that we've all lived with fairly well since then, which doesn't much allow for preemptive war.
Delay in decision and inaction could lead to a massive and sudden horror.
It simply makes no sense to wait any longer.
Take action before it's too late. We will not wait. I believe it is essential that when we see a threat, we deal with those threats before they become imminent. It's too late if they become imminent.
As President Bush has said, time is not on our side.
It was a rushed NIE. It was done, I believe, in 3 or 4 weeks, which is really fast for that. It wasn't done earlier, from what I understand, because the Bush administration didn't want such a document that had caveats.
That's why they never asked for a comprehensive national intelligence estimate within the intelligence community on this particular problem, because they knew the intelligence community didn't agree on any of these issues.
The National Intelligence Estimate is really about, 5 major players, 10 intelligence agencies in total, weighing in on the basic situation of weapons of mass destruction. It only happened because the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Graham, called for it. And so I think the Bush administration resisted having an NIE, and then once it was out, selectively picked what was useful to their argument.
Most of their qualifications were simply filtered out.
The sanitization of the original estimate was not true to its real meaning. All the modifiers were dropped off.
It was a prosecutor making a case, using what benefited his case, ignoring evidence that would undermine his case, and there was no defense attorney to give us the other side.
And the end product used by policymakers, particularly in its discussion with the American public, were much more forceful than could have possibly been when originally written by CIA, DIA, or State Department's intelligence and research.
It was a bizarre warping of the intelligence process, and they thought they would be able to get away with it because who's going to see the classified version? Well, later, several months later, they released parts of the classified version. They thought no one would notice.
So this was not a case where the national intelligence estimate was driving the war. This was to provide an excuse after the fact.
Going to war, they thought, this is yet another example, I think, of intelligence simply not being able by nature, by definition, to live up to that kind of requirement. You may produce intelligence to keep you out of it, but I doubt you'll ever get 1, 2, 3 reports of intelligence that will in any way allow you to go to war.
They're Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein cavorts with terrorists.
Secretly, without fingerprints, he could provide non-decision weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own.
Well, the war really had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. There was no connection whatsoever between Iraq and the secular regime there and the religious.
And there it is. That's the leader of the CIA.
They wanted to believe that there was a connection, but
there's no
CIA
connection.
Was sitting there, the FBI was sitting there, I was sitting there saying, we've looked at this issue for years. For years we've looked for a connection. And there's just no connection.
Saddam was not a maniac or a fool. He was a terrible villain, yes, but he was not going to sacrifice his own life and the future of his country to secret adventures with terrorists.
It is just inconceivable to anybody who understands Saddam Hussein and understands the nature of highly centralized dictatorships in general, that dictators would want to give up control of their most potent weapon. Because once you've given up control, you have no control. So you can't say to Al-Qaeda you will use it, you won't use it. The decision on whether or not they irrational being in the sense that he was going to ensure his own demise by doing something like that.
Al-Qaeda has had total contempt for Saddam Hussein himself. He's been a socialist. He's been very harsh. He's treated Islamic leaders, Islamist leaders, extremely harshly.
Iraq, and we have very good intelligence on this, was not part of the picture of terrorism before we invaded. Saddam Hussein and bin Laden were enemies. Bin Laden considered and said that Saddam Hussein was the socialist infidel. These were very different kinds of individuals competing for power in their own way, and Saddam Hussein made very sure that Al-Qaeda
How do they say Sodom?
in Iraq, that terrorists couldn't function, except for the small northeastern
Sodom.
portion of the country where there was an extremist group, but he had no control over that. It was merely
There's no doubt that Ansar al-Islam is a radical Islamic terrorist group with ties to Al-Qaeda, but they operate in a part of Iraq that is not controlled by Hussein. They say they seek to overthrow Hussein and his government.
We believe that Saddam Hussein outside Islamic zone.
The ties with Al-Qaeda was just a scare tactic to exploit the trauma, the very real trauma that the American people have felt ever since 9/11, and to associate that trauma with Iraq. As you know from the polls, most Americans believe that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, and it was a very successful, very deliberate, and very unethical, immoral operation on the part of the PR people of this administration.
We now know that Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Among other sources, we've gotten this from first-hand testimony from defectors.
Access to immigrants and defectors with more direct access to the program.
The Iraqi defectors who know that Iraq in the late 1990s had several mobile biological weapons labs.
It was only after defectors told us about it. The inspectors were in the country.
The most important information that inspectors have ever gotten on what's going on in Iraq have come from defectors.
We know about that capability from defectors and other sources.
Recent defectors stated that as recently as August of 1998, that's while inspections were still going on, a formal order was issued to proceed with the nuclear program at full blast.
Our strategy is to bring to the world the danger that Saddam poses in his current state.
Without doubt, he is developing weapons of mass destruction. Without doubt, he has chemical and biological weapons. And without doubt, for 30 years, he has been trying to acquire a nuclear weapon.
The usual scrutiny of these kind of guys was just not done adequately. There was this attitude of let's find the smoking gun, let's find the evidence, rather than let's look at what's out there and weigh the evidence.
They wanted to believe it. It goes back to contacts that we made in the early 1990s with individuals like Dick Cheney, like Paul Wolfowitz, like Richard Torres, dealing with Ahmed Chalabi. They became enamored of this fellow who dressed like a Westerner, talked with a British accent, and appeared to be upper crust, and therefore was quite believable.
And I thought people had really checked out of reality in order to go to war. It was a war future that had taken over.
These people wanted to get back into it. In fact, they couldn't defeat Saddam Hussein, but they knew that U.S. military power could. So the worst of these offenders, who would be Ahmad Chalabi, who's been in exile for his own country for 20 to 30 years, really not a hero under any definition of heroism, to his own people, sold the Pentagon on the idea that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction and he must be stopped.
But they were bringing
I'm dead for some reason. Why am I dead for some reason? Because the ghosts keep attacking over and over.
Money, first of all, because Chalabi was paying money.
Oh,
Supplying money shouldn't be a surprise. That's how informants are dealt with in the spy system.
But there was no effort to check the book.
Not every checkable piece of that intelligence that has come to public notice has proven to be false, or at least self-serving in the extreme.
You have the U.S. Congress approve and appropriate money for the Iraqi National Congress, and no telling how much they would take in that to top for themselves.
You get all kinds of people who want a reward and have nothing to offer. And many ended up with Chalabi because they would believe anything about Iraq.
It was phony evidence. It was based on intelligence we had from Iraqi exiles who wanted this country to attack Iraq so these people could then take over in Baghdad and establish their own regime.
So we have to go back and examine just the role that defectors played throughout the entire inspection process.
Inspections work, then you don't overthrow Saddam Hussein.
How does somebody like that, I don't know even how to describe him, get into a position where he's determining U.S. policy?
Senior members of the Department of Defense gave him their thumbs up. His information was coming into the White House to people like Dick Cheney through the Office of Special Plans. So it was coming into it through an avenue that's not traditional to the intelligence community and wasn't open to being vetted or reviewed. We've had Chalabi himself admit that they didn't mind providing false information because it helped them to achieve their goal of removing Saddam.
Nobody in Iraq will defend that regime, including the military, both the regular army and the Republican Guard.
Our liberation would not have been achieved without the determination of President George W. Bush and the commitment of the coalition, at the forefront of which stand the people of the United States of America and Great Britain. The Iraqis will never forget your courage and sacrifice on our behalf. We are here today to declare that a new Iraq is born, an Iraq where dignity, justice, and human rights are assured for all citizens.
There is no risk of a breakup of Iraq, that there is no risk of a civil war.
I stand before this assembly as a representative of free Iraq. To all those here who helped us in our struggle for liberation, we extend our gratitude.
The Iraqi opposition will ensure the continuation of its institutions and to re-establish democracy and the rule of law.
He said, I got what I wanted. I got my war. I'm back in Iraq. And if you people relied on my information, you're stupid.
Every year, by law and by custom, we meet here to consider the state of the Union. This year we gather in this chamber deeply aware of decisive days that lie ahead.
Bush presented so many distorted beliefs, estimates, and guesstimates. He appeared that he was deceiving the public and the Congress.
Saddam Hussein had materials to produce as much as 500 tons of cement.
Any sarin that they were making in 1990, 1991 had a known shelf life of 2 months. I have confirmed with inspectors and analysts who were deeply involved in the 1990s analysis. Well, if you made it 12 years ago and it had a shelf life of 2 months, it may not be safe to drink, but it isn't sarin nerve gas any longer. And there's no way the agency could not have known that.
U.S. intelligence indicates that Saddam Hussein had upwards of 30,000 munitions capable of delivering chemical agents. Inspectors recently turned up 16 of them, despite Iraq's recent declaration denying their existence.
And then they tried to use the fact that inspectors found 16 of these as evidence that thousands more existed. And again, I mean, as a methodology, it's a very weak way to predict anything. And I think it borders on propaganda to argue that the small number that have been found by inspectors imply that, in this case, over 29,000 exist.
Saddam Hussein has not accounted for the remaining 29,984 of these prohibited munitions.
Because the Bush administration officials either routinely said or tried to give the impression that if Iraq had not fully accounted for all of a certain item involved related to chemical or biological weapons, then it must be there. And that's not at all what he said.
He's given no evidence that he has destroyed it.
And the inspectors can go in and say, okay, we can prove the item destroyed that set this way or that set that way. But these others we can't prove. And that doesn't mean that they didn't destroy or whatever the item was. It just means Iraq hadn't been able to prove it.
If Saddam Hussein had admitted to the Iranians, to the Syrians, and his own people that he had been so intimidated by the UN inspection and sanctions process that he'd given up all that, they probably would have torn him limb from limb.
Saddam Hussein had material sufficient to produce more than 38,000 liters of botulinum
Fucking
toxin.
liars. Fucking Republicans.
Enough to subject millions of people to death by respiratory failure. He hadn't accounted for that.
That did not happen.
Its biological weapons program, particularly its ability to make botulinum toxin, and therefore it was an open issue. But again, it doesn't mean that what the inspectors found was evidence that Iraq possessed it.
Our intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production.
I think there was very little doubt that the centrifuge tubes, so-called, were nothing but rocket motor tubes to go into M81 style artillery rockets. They certainly have all the specs for that.
Nuclear experts, for instance, from Lawrence Livermore's laboratory's Z Division, the experts on centrifuge enrichment, came out and said, no, you couldn't enrich uranium using these tubes. They're not compatible.
Well, I saw it as a deliberate attempt to take information and selectively take information and try to basically say Iraq poses an imminent nuclear threat, and therefore action is absolute. And I know that's absolute.
The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program.
The administration showed photos of nuclear or former nuclear weapon sites in Iraq pre-1991 nuclear weapon sites, claimed that new construction showed they were ongoing nuclear weapons production sites. Complete nonsense.
The most troubling thing about the fact sources and misleading statements that Bush gave is that it is a federal felony to mislead and distort information.
The British government reported that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
When Secretary Powell addressed the UN about weapons of mass destruction, he deliberately left out any reference to attempts to buy uranium from Africa.
I didn't use the uranium at that point because I didn't think that was sufficiently strong as evidence to present before the world.
CIA officials warned members of the president's staff the intelligence was not good enough to make the statement, Iraq tried to buy uranium from Africa.
In October for the Cincinnati speech, not for the State of the Union, but the Cincinnati speech, George Tenet asked that this be taken out of the Cincinnati speech, the reference to yellow cake. It was taken out of the Cincinnati speech because whenever the director of Central Intelligence wants something out, it's gone.
How to get back in?
It's not a matter of getting back in. It's a matter of 3+ months later, people didn't remember that George Tenet had asked that it be taken out of the Cincinnati speech, and then it was cleared by the agency.
Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
Just 16 words in the State of the Union address, words that we now know were misleading. And retired Syria diplomat Joe Wilson tried to warn the administration of just that nearly a year before the speech.
I received a call from the CIA in February 2000, invited out to talk to those people within the broader intelligence community who deal with 3 different subjects: Iraq, uranium, and Niger. I briefed them on what I knew about the uranium business. It was during the course of that briefing that they said that they had received a report that had piqued the interest of the Office of the Vice President. And that report was of a purported memorandum of agreement authorizing the sale of uranium yellowcake, somewhat enriched uranium, from Niger to Iraq. And it was a document that was executed by the government of Niger. They asked me if I would be willing to go out and take another look at it and talk to people I knew there. I left there telling them that if they wanted, I would be able to free up my schedule. They subsequently called me and said, please do. I spent the 8 days there drinking mint tea and talking to everybody there was to talk to who knew anything about the subject matter in Niamey. And I'd come back persuaded that it not have happened. One, from a business perspective, because of the way the consortium was structured, you just couldn't do it without a lot of people knowing. And 2, decision without a lot of people knowing. And if you made the decision would be reflected in a series of signatures on the documents. And if the documents did not contain those signatures, they could not be authentic government or media documents.
The President quoted a British paper. We did not know at the time. No one knew at the time in our circles. Maybe someone knew down in the bowels of the agency, but no one in our circles knew that there were doubts and suspicions that this might be a forgery. Of course, it was information that was mistaken, but it was a relatively small part of the case about nuclear weapons and nuclear reconstitution. It is also the case that the broad picture about Iraq's programs was a picture that went very far back in time.
Now, given what I knew about where the question had originated, and given what I knew about the way the government works, I knew that people in her circle did know.
Based on thorough analysis, the IA has concluded with the concurrence of outside experts that these documents, which form the basis of the reports of recent uranium transactions between Iraq and Niger, are in fact not authentic.
Numerous French words were misspelled in the documents. One of the letters was signed by a Niger official who had left office 10 years ago. Several dates in the documents were not matched to the day of the week. Several of the names and titles of officials mentioned in the documents were incorrect.
We all know that the documentation on Yellow Paper from Niger was fake. But why doesn't anybody say who did it, who fixed it? And why don't we take another look then at the same stream of consciousness that was prevailing at that moment on the aluminum tubes and even the trailers, trailers that were surrounding it. At that point, someone's got to say, who is putting this intelligence out there and why? And I don't think that question's been answered, and maybe it will be answered. And it's not a question.
Who was it that asked for this review of the Niger nuclear material testing? It was the Vice President. Mr. Wilson, former ambassador, was sent to Niger in response to the Vice President's questions about this issue. So assumedly, the Vice President got a report back in response to his question, and that report contained the Wilson memo, his assessment of the situation.
The question remains, who did the document report and why? The list is possibly short. Somebody ought to do it.
Wilson says his family was the subject of a smear campaign by senior administration officials. They deliberately leaked his wife's identity as a covert CIA operative, damaging her future career and compromising past missions. After he criticized the administration on Meet the Press and in the New York Times.
The White House Hatchet came out and started writing articles in which they basically said that Wilson, the first one came out and said that Wilson told the truth because he's a Democrat. They'll set that up as an argument. Democrats tell the truth, ergo Republicans fill in the blank. Then a couple of senior administration officials leaked to Bob Novak that my wife was a CIA operative involved in the weapons of mass destruction business at the CIA.
Senior administration officials is a key to very the president, vice president, cabinet officers, and the top of the White House have gone out of their way to get that information out. Not only Novak, but Time Magazine, they wanted that information. Now, that's against a statutory law that prohibits the identification of CIA operatives.
What you're doing when you expose a CIA officer of any name, you're basically taking their entire career and flushing it down the toilet.
It also has the potential of placing that person in jeopardy because of their operations and their own operations and even their operations. So it's a very vengeful act against the ambassador to try to hurt him by hurting his wife's career, if not wishing for physical damage. I have never seen it that it could be a hit.
The President of the United States and an administration who has come to office on a platform of restoring dignity and honor to the White House. What they did was neither dignified, nor was it terribly honorable, nor was it germane to the issue at hand.
Theater, a masterful theater, effective theater at the time. Here's a man who has tremendous credibility. He presents himself to the Security Council, to the American people, to the international public, and stares the camera in the eye and says, he knows Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option.
My first visual impression here, watching George Tenet, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, back there as a prop, almost like a potted plant, as if to say that the Central Intelligence Agency stands behind, or in this case sits behind, everything that Colin Powell says. That was a terrific blow to the morale of the Central Intelligence Agency analysts.
Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons, although they can be very deadly in a subway station or something like this, are not really strategic weapons. They are weapons that can kill 50, 100, 200 people, but in fact they won't devastate you the way a nuclear weapon in New York City or Chicago or someplace would hit in a deadly blow.
Saddam Hussein has used these horrific weapons on another country and on his own people.
He used weapons Saddam Hussein did back in the 1980s when the U.S. administration, the Reagan administration, was actually supporting him and allowing him to import the chemical precursors for that. Donald Rumsfeld, actually, as a special envoy for Ronald Reagan back in those years, helped, open the door for better relations between Washington and Baghdad.
Colin Powell spoke of thousands of liters of anthrax that were unaccounted for. He said they're probably hiding it. And then he held up a little vial of white powder. And he said, a couple teaspoons of white powder like this, thousands of American cities kill thousands of Americans. If he was truly to reflect the Iraqi capability, he would have held up a bottle of Diet Coke. And said the Iraqis produced anthrax that looked like this. It was a shelf life for 3 years. The last known production batch came out in 1991. So even if Iraq was hiding this brown smudged liquid, it would be useless today.
Just a few weeks ago, we intercepted communications between two commanders in Iraq's 2nd Republican Guard Corps.
If you know anything about Iraq, they have very strict communication security procedures. So you would never have military personnel speaking in the clear over a radio about sensitive subjects.
On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers.
There were never any chemical weapons necessary. I'm intimately familiar with that facility. I've inspected it a number of times. Other inspectors have inspected it many more times than I have.
I believe they were proof. I believe the statement that Iraq would put its crown jewels in the one building or one of the few buildings that either the United States will bomb first or the inspectors will go to first.
The truck you also see is a signature item. It's a decontamination vehicle.
The UN weapons inspectors knew that the trucks shown by Colin Powell in those photographs were fire trucks, not decontamination trucks.
I would have to comment here on
Wish me luck.
State Colin Powell's
9 kills, 3 left.
It was highly embarrassing for those of us who know something about the business. We couldn't tell whether this was an honest mistake by those who now do the imagery analysis, who now report to the Secretary of Defense, unlike our day when they reported to the Central Intelligence Agency. Whether that was the case or whether perhaps Colin Powell was set up.
All kinds of analysis of satellite imagery. You can't form any conclusions on what's going on inside the building. They could have been building tractors. They could have been doing nothing inside the building.
Now look at the picture on the right. You are now looking at 2 The signature vehicles are gone. It's been cleaned up. And it was done on the 22nd of December as the UN inspection team was arriving.
Contamination vehicles, they rotate site to site. And so the absence of the vehicle on the second photo, which we know is the 22nd of December, could just as easily be explained by the normal rotation, because you didn't tell us the date of the first, and it was several weeks before.
We have noted that the two satellite images of the site were taken several weeks apart. The reported movement of munitions at the site could just as easily have been a routine activity as a movement of prescribed munitions in anticipation of imminent inspection.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails.
These mobile labs have been shown to be nothing more than hydrogen generation facilities.
Here you see both truck and rail car mounted mobile factories.
When you take a look at the mobile labs that Colin Powell discussed, he didn't put up photographs of these facilities. He put up artist renditions of these facilities. Why? Because we have no proof they exist.
This video of an Iraqi test flight obtained by UNSCOM some years ago shows an Iraqi F-1 Mirage aircraft. Note the spray coming from beneath the Mirage. That is 2,000 liters of simulated anthrax. Iraqis continue to visit bin Laden in his new home in Afghanistan.
George Tenet ambushed and spent a year and a half of torturous investigation, torturous analysis, to see if there were ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. They found none.
Our conservative estimate is that Iraq today has a stockpile of between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agents.
So Secretary of State is telling us that our conservative estimate is that Iraq possesses between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agents, enough to fill 16,000 warheads in the battlefield. Where are they? What happened to them? My suspicion is that this is not our conservative estimate, that this sounds very much to me like our neo-conservative estimate.
Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies.
It was a masterful performance, but none of it was true. Where are all these weapons? Where is all the GMs? Where is all the anthrax?
Probably one of the low points
What?
no assurance whatsoever.
To eliminate by inspection
The good fight.
Good
fight.
On the contrary, there's a great danger that it would provide false comfort that Saddam was somehow back in his box.
The reality is that between the original UNSCOM inspection and the UNMOVIC inspection, you destroyed, with those inspections, 90 to probably 95% of the Iraqi arsenal.
Well, second place isn't bad. Jesus, 84. Grats, good fight.
Post-war U.S. battle damage assessments.
I did so much damage to him. So much. Fucking 900 something. Bullshit. Fucking bullshit.
They had that country under control.
By 1998 at the latest, those inspectors had discovered
Just because his sword was superior.
weapons of mass destruction
Fucking so
and
annoying.
the Iraqi programs at that point were essentially at an end.
Before the war in Iraq, the United
I shouldn't
Nations
do the sniper rifle. It's not good.
that,
It was just,
Saddam
you know,
Hussein,
gold.
did not have nuclear weapons capability.
Ironically, the major effect of the invasion of Iraq in terms of weapons of mass destruction has been to show that the inspectors were right all along.
The inspection regime, it was the most intrusive inspection regime in history, and it still is. And at the end of the day, that's another reason why we don't do it.
these maniacs who are encouraging our enemies, weakening our troops' resolve, and confusing the American people.
Well, you should listen to this protest because obviously
Thank you, Real Story Sub. Like and sub to your channel.
who would have guessed that you could build a massive international peace movement on the protection of Saddam Hussein?
The media is culpable for the misleading of the American public. They bought into the Bush administration's rhetoric.
They don't understand that there is moral violence and immoral violence. We used moral violence. God bless this president. He is truly a great man.
Reducing troop morale, confusing the American people, and emboldening our enemies. They are absolutely committing sedition or treason as far as I'm concerned. There's a huge difference between a personal opinion and an opinion which degrades and debases our military in a time of war. It's a disgrace.
I don't believe that mainstream media
Look at his tail. His tail is actually really funny.
Accused me of drinking Saddam Hussein's Kool-Aid, making accurate statements in response to aluminum tubes.
People out there accusing you of drinking Saddam Hussein's Kool-Aid.
I'm an ideologue, then I'm a Republican ideologue. I'm actually a fairly conservative person and voted for George W. Bush. But I don't allow my ideology to get in the way of the facts and the reality of my duties and responsibilities as an American citizen.
If you want to kill the message, to go after the messenger. If you can discredit the messenger, then you discredit the message. Or if you can make the story about the messenger, then people forget about the message.
I think it's so unfair to try to silence debate and criticism by attacking those who say something with which you disagree.
The media is supposed to be the fourth administration on this.
In a way, the administration constructed a box where, and that box had all the information that the administration wanted the media and the public and Congress to have.
What they would do is you'd have the Iraqi National Congress taking bogus defectors, the information from them, giving them to the Pentagon, and then the Iraqi National Congress then giving them to the journalists. And they said, if you don't believe us, the Iraqi National Congress called the Pentagon. So you had the circular reporting, and you had the New York Times admitting that it was using one source for all of its information on weapons of mass destruction. And it was, self-affirming by going to the Pentagon, which just put this stuff on paper.
It was a lot of exaggerations, partial information, sometimes the whole information, but on balance, a very one-sided view of Iraq's WMD program.
And a lot of these stories the journalists didn't want to look into because editors told them to run with. We're going to be supportive of the administration. It's a patriotic thing to do.
I think that there was, on the part of the media, too much of in a sense, getting into the upcoming war and not enough to look at what we really need.
There were some journalists out there raising the alarm bells. The Seymour Hirsches, the Walter Pincuses of the world. But unfortunately, those great investigative reporters, they're usually exiled when the heat is on. And it's only after the fact that they end up being praised and given the pats on the back.
The excitement was to make the case to go to war. To show that, and that was the controversy that the media loved, is, it was the titillation of a WMD hitting us, not the titillation or the conflict of attacking the administration.
Both the Washington Post and the New York Times. It's very conservative editors. It supported the White
But early on,
it doesn't matter if it's a bot, it's still funny. One shot, one kill. It was a good shot. Quite by accident, but I got him. It was clean. Ooh, blue chest. Come on, sword. I mean, that's good, yeah. It's not bad.
the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder.
His regime has an active program to acquire and develop nuclear weapons, and let there be no doubt about it. We know for a fact that there are weapons.
And they push this hard. And of course, raw intelligence data can be interpreted in lots of ways, I'm sure experts have talked to you about. And so there were a group of people, I think, that were adamant that this was the right course to pursue.
Ooh, come on, sword. Oh. Yeah, it's better than this one.
We found the weapons of mass destruction. We
No, you
found
didn't.
biological laboratories.
No, you didn't.
Everybody knows that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
I have every reason to believe that the intelligence that we were operating off was correct.
No question we have said that Saddam Hussein possesses biological and chemical weapons.
We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad and east, west, south, and north somewhere.
All this will be made clear in the course of the operation for whatever duration it takes.
Are you confident that you'll also find weapons of mass destruction?
I believe we will find evidence of the programs of chemical and biological weapons, yes.
How about the actual weapons?
Well, I just don't know. Let's wait and see what the team that's over there...
Actions continue with our new exploitation teams that have been brought in.
And that we will in fact find weapons or evidence of weapons programs that are conclusive.
It is somewhat puzzling, I think, that you can have 100% certainty about the weapons of mass destruction's existence and zero certainty about where they are.
Do you agree? And does it matter whether or not you
Well, you
find
might
those
ask
weapons?
the Prime Minister that. We won't be proven wrong.
This is a
We won't be
process
proven
that
wrong.
takes some time, and it will ebb and flow.
One thing we know is that he had a weapons program.
I don't know anybody that I can think of.
One
who
thing we
has
know, he had a
contended
weapons
that
program.
The Iraqis had nuclear weapons. We believe he does.
Turns out that was a complete fucking lie.
Weapons of mass destruction. It's going to take time, and we're going to have to be patient.
It's going to take time to find anything because they
will find that we presented a solid case that is there and was there and will remain there.
It's going to take a period of time to find the people. I don't think we'll discover anything.
Still felt like 3.5 months for new inspections was a rather short time before Bullet Bay, and especially when the announcement they say the U.S. government said that you have to have the information. Who can say that?
I believe that we will find the truth, and the truth is he was developing a program for weapons of mass destruction.
What happens is we'll discover people who will tell us where to find it.
People start to talk to you.
It is not like a treasure hunt where you just run around looking everywhere hoping you find something. I just don't think that's going to happen. The inspectors didn't find anything, and I doubt that we will.
Our people are going to find out the truth, and the truth will say that this intelligence is good intelligence, no doubt in my mind.
What we will do is find the people who tell us. There are a lot of people who lie and get away with it, and that's just a fact.
He has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors.
We are able to keep arms from him with
military forces have not been rebuilt. Is U.S. credibility on the line over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Depends on the assumption. Depends on how long it goes on.
What we've done, we've taken estimates looking at different variables and said, if this were the case on this variable, but there's so many variables that the numbers of possible point answers create a range that simply isn't useful.
I'm just not going to get into any speculation about numbers.
We're dealing with a country.
I'm not gonna get into speculation about numbers. I'm not gonna get into speculation about numbers. I'm not gonna get into speculation about numbers.
From Iraqi oil revenue, as everyone has said, they think it's going to be something like $2 billion this year. They think it might be something like 15, 12 next year. They think it might be something like 18 to 20 plus the next 19. The next year.
I will soon submit to Congress a request for $87 billion.
Why did the administration so dramatically underestimate the cost of this war?
We did not have perfect foresight into what we were going to find in Iraq.
With the cost of the war rising and the search for weapons of mass destruction going nowhere, the administration turns to David Kay.
This work is being carried out under the direction of Dr. David Kay, a respected scientist and former UN inspector who is leading the weapons search in Iraq.
We are determined to take this apart. We have a tremendous group of dedicated American men and women involved in this with the best assets of the intelligence community can provide.
Yet Dr. Kay and his team are making progress.
We have found a large body of continuing activities and equipment. We are surprised by new advances that we're making.
Network of laboratories and safe houses controlled by Iraqi intelligence and security services.
And unlike pre-war intelligence, we don't require someone just to say something. We actually need the physical evidence.
Equipment suitable for continuing chemical and biological weapons research.
David Kay is not going to be done with this for quite some time.
David Kay wants more time. And he says it could take another 6 to 9 months to make a definitive finding.
The administration is asking Congress for hundreds of millions more.
$600 million to fund the continuing search. We have not yet found shiny, pointy things that I would call a weapon.
Before we can draw firm conclusions, we need to let the Iraq Survey Group complete its work.
We were all wrong, probably, in my judgment. And that is most disturbing.
It's inevitable that there will be an outside commission appointed on an issue of this gravity.
Have public hearings, and we will get to the bottom of this, and we will let the chips fall where they may.
Democracy, you have an obligation. Your obligation is to speak truthfully to the public. That's the basis of civility and our belief in our system of government.
It is going to require an outside effort, probably through an outside commission, to deal with some of these very serious problems.
Because I think explanations are important in a democracy.
This whole episode has caught the White House completely by surprise.
They've become so fearful of admitting error that they stand up and defend things that on their face are untruthful.
President Bush is being pounded with calls for an independent
Pounded with calls.
into how U.S. intelligence so badly
Getting pounded with
misjudged
calls.
capabilities before the war.
Having the president holding all the cards, appointing all the people, having everybody accountable to him is a very bad idea.
If you say you're going to war because he and you don't find those weapons, it is not persuasive to jump to a second argument. That didn't work, but here I've got a second explanation.
What was that?
If I would care to try to operationalize some of the comments I made about what was going wrong in Iraq. And so I said, if you, among other things, that if you're going to do this, you had to treat it like an intelligence problem, and that is not go looking for hidden weapons, but going looking for the people who would be associated with hidden weapons. So what I did is I formed teams for each of the areas, and we formed half of the hypothesis that it was there, and the other half said it wasn't there. And both followed exactly the same method. If you believe it's there, what is the proof that will in fact prove that hypothesis, or what evidence clashes with it. Same thing is true with the teams that took the hypothesis it wasn't there, is, you know, collecting evidence. So yeah, you start with a viewpoint, a hypothesis, an academic would say, and you collect the evidence that will support our challenge. You tell them, you know, go form and discuss with your team a hypothesis and get a strategy for doing it. And I just, you know, I was unsure whether they would come back pro or con. And I really didn't care. And that was intentional because I didn't want to be seen as stacking the deck. And we met every Saturday afternoon. And each team went through a very almost, it was rigorous, but almost predictable. You started with, here's our hypothesis, here's what we've done this week, here's how the evidence stacks, here's what we propose to do the next week. And there would be a discussion between the groups and myself on each of them of what they were doing. There's a gradual build-up of evidence that forces you to challenge your pre-existing belief and then keeps generating either more questions or generates questions about the hypothesis. For example, give you a real case. One of the first things that worried me was we had a big army running through Iraq in March and April. WMD was not used against them, nor was it planned. That's sort of remarkable that they've had large stockpiles. I really believe in the jungle telegram. Put the word out on the street. Let people know what you're about and what you have to offer. And usually you get people coming to you. And I had a lot of money to work with. And I had green cards or passports to virtually any attractive place in the world. You come to us with weapons of mass destruction, evidence about the weapons, and we'll take care of it. All I had coming to me were fabricators. People who said it but didn't have anything, had absolutely no evidence. Iraq was a horrible...
What are you talking about? That guy was aimbot. What are you talking about?
It was remarkable to me and disturbing that in a place this bad, who wouldn't want a golden lifeboat to get out? All they had to do was come within sight. I would protect their identity. It was clear to everyone. I would take their whole family. It wasn't a case you have to leave your family behind. You'll be taken care of, but you'll have to find a new family in California. Some of them might like to. But no one bought. And so that worried me. Around a weapons program, if a weapons program exists, you're going to find people engaged in the production, the technology, engineering, design, people involved in protecting the weapons, people involved in moving them, and people involved in preparing to use the weapons. We found none of that. We were running into fewer and fewer leads that looked profitable, and a lot of evidence stacked up to explain something other than large stockpiles of weapons. I had the habit of writing a personal report back every weekend, which was quite separate than the official reports back saying, you know, this is what it looks, smells like, and here are the issues of the week. Here's how I'm proposing this to. I've always found that's a good way to keep people informed of what you're doing. I don't think there was a surprise about the conclusions I was drawing because those were fully and I think completely inadequately reported. I think the surprise was to speak out and say that. I had the privilege, although I didn't always think it was a privilege, of watching a lot of very senior government officials come to agonizing terms about Vietnam and decide not to speak out because they knew they'd never be asked to lunch again. They wouldn't be part of the process. And I think like a lot of people of my age and my generation who were in the government, by no means speaking to me, just decided that whenever the occasion came...
I look so weird. I look like an airplane.
This committee has a special responsibility to the men and women of our armed forces to look into pre-war intelligence because planning for military operations is based on
policymakers take data, they interpret threats, they assess. If you talk about a mushroom cloud, how much more imminent threat would there be?
left out of the public.
Ooh.
Many of us feel that the evidence so far leads only to one conclusion. What has happened was more than a failure of intelligence. The result of manipulation of the intelligence. Justified decision to go to war.
Secret societies have their own rules, and secret societies generally don't feel an obligation to openly and democratically communicate.
Prime Minister Blair has set up a similar commission in Great Britain.
Yeah.
His is going to report back in July.
Right.
Ours is not going to be until March of 2005, 5 months after the presidential election.
Yeah.
Shouldn't the American people have the benefit of the commission before the election?
Well, the reason why
What's with all the really good weapons? The fuck?
This was a strategic look, kind of a big picture look about
Okay, I'll take it.
The intelligence gathering capacities of the United States of America.
I think every president should have kept on their desk the statement, the carved statement that Harry Truman had, the buck stops here.
If there are no weapons of mass destruction, which there aren't, if there are no ties with Al-Qaeda, which there weren't, and which there aren't, or
Which there weren't, and which there aren't.
then why do we go to war?
Then why do we go to war?
Well, all you need do is go on the web and download Project for a New American Century. There you will find ideological underpinnings for this policy, which was rejected by George Bush first, ridiculed out of town. It became the devout policy of this government and was implemented starting with the war.
I felt in my last year in the Pentagon a great deal of contempt for the constraints on government that our Constitution lays out. And I also felt that there was a contempt for the Constitution, and I only absorbed this sense of contempt by association with some of these senior appointed civilians.
Who are all neoconservatives, who all believe in dominance, who believe in preemption, who believe in the military option as the first resort rather than the last resort.
They have had a very fixed, indeed almost obsessive idea that in fact Iraq is a major actor in the world and a probable threat, possibly a deadly threat to the United States.
This is a group of people who have essentially believed that might makes right, that the United States at this stage of history has unchallengeable power and therefore a responsibility to use it to make the world over in the manner that we, or they rather, think it ought to be made over.
I think behind the basic neoconservative philosophy is considerable arrogance that American interests are the primary goal of all American foreign policy.
And they seem to have a really serious habit of not being interested in listening to what other people say about this subject.
Now, of course, American interests should matter, but there are enlightened and unenlightened elements of self-interest. And I think in this case, we have determined and defined our interests globally in almost total disregard of what other states want, what their concerns are, how they might or might not be able to contribute. We're on a roll. You're either with us or get out of the way. I find remarkably little interest in the character of other countries, the nature of their problems and difficulties. This is a glory. Neoconservatives who really see this as quite irrelevant. What other people, what the political culture of other societies are, what they want, what their people might want, whatever their concerns might be. It's really quite irrelevant because we know what we're going to do and give out. Don't agree.
He said, look, he brought down evil empire. Now he's bringing down Arab nationalism as personified by Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad. And once that happens, the problem is those people have not set foot. They've been in the Middle East and in Tel Aviv only.
No, I don't think it's an accident at all that so much of the justification misleading, deliberately so.
They thought they had a place in history. They were going to bring down, obviously, a very dysfunctional Arab peninsula, as well as Iran, and they were going to change history. They believed they won the Cold War. And they said, all right, we won the Cold War, we're tough, the Soviet Union, we get tough with these people, and they're going to become like us.
It is fair to say that the Iraq War was a diversion from the war on terrorism. It certainly meant that people
What?
As much attention to Afghanistan as they should have, and the resources that might have gone to Afghanistan ended up being focused more in Iraq.
If you attack no different. People are going to say, wait a minute, this isn't a war on terrorism. This is a war on imperialism. You know? And this is why it's a distraction, because you need the help of these people. If you get this view of the CIA and the lurking around the czars and troops in the Middle East, handcuffing people or assassinating people, you've got to have the help of the world to identify these people and either put them in jail or in positions where they can do harm.
In January of 2002, as I was sitting in the bunker of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, and I and several colleagues were sitting around the room, we were working TV, and lo and behold, here came the infamous statement of the axis of evil, you know, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And we all looked at ourselves and went, oh my God, you know, here we are kind of in ground zero of Afghanistan. And Washington's talking in very belligerent terms about these other three countries, and we don't have Afghanistan anywhere close to being settled.
The only person Saddam was a threat to at this point, as we saw when the army collapsed, was to Iraq. He didn't have he wasn't scaring anybody. He certainly wasn't scaring the Iranians or the Turks or the Saudis or anybody else. It was a state that was on the verge of failure. Now it is a failed state. Failed states cause terrorism. You can name it. Afghanistan, Lebanon, Somalia. Anytime you create a vacuum where people flock to discontented to fight wars.
Osama bin Laden had been saying for years, America will invade Arab countries and occupy an oil-rich Arab country. He'd been saying this was part of his propaganda. So what did we do after 9/11? We invade an oil-rich and occupy an oil-rich Arab country, which was doing nothing to threaten us.
The only real connection is that having invaded Iraq, we are very likely to make it a focus of terrorism. We are likely to produce what the president has said Iraq represents, namely the second battle war on terrorism. Why? Because we've sent a lot of Americans into a place where they're sitting ducks for people who think the only good American is a dead one.
Iraq cannot be governed by Americans. I don't care what the intention is. I don't care if we truly want to build a democracy. It cannot be ruled by a foreign power.
We, as the one indispensable nation of the world, that we characterize ourselves for so long in the last, cannot contemplate that possibly someone else might not like everything we call the American way of life, and that they would, in fact, welcome us into
The only tool in the toolbox is military force. Military force is a very instrument war. We created more terrorists in Iraq, and we haven't even solved the problem in Afghanistan.
One of the more ironic effects of the attack on Iraq was to buttress other countries in the conviction of the instinct marked by the Indian general after the first Gulf War. And he said the lesson of this war is that if you have to fight the United States, you better have nuclear weapons.
In some respects, it's as if Vietnam didn't even happen. It's as if a lot of our leaders have suffered some kind of historical and political lobotomy. And that's frightening. And every American should be concerned about that. Because the United States ultimately is supposed to be an exemplar for the United States. We're supposed to be Ronald Reagan. We've violated, I think, fundamental principles that have guided this country's foreign policy so successfully since 1947.
You don't want your president to be seen as a hot dog. And when your president gets into a jumpsuit and gets in the back of a jet and lands on an aircraft carrier and then waddles out with his little straps between his legs. And that's not, I mean, you want a sign of kind of maturity and not testosterone blasting through when you're talking about things so fundamentally important as sending them to the war, sending young men and women to their deaths.
There is a sense in Washington now that you can't raise objections to this because you're not supporting troops in the field. I would rapidly point out that unlike almost anybody I know that holds office in this country, I've had 2 sons in uniform, both of whom have been in combat, and so I don't have to take any nonsense from anybody, nor will I.
Mark Twain's definition of patriotism. Patriotism is supporting your country all the time, and your government will reverse it. I don't think it's patriotic to stand by
and remain silent while your country stumbles into disaster.
Patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, and I think these are scoundrels. They have no argument now. They have no defense for what they did. The country is in a terrible international security situation that I think is terrible. So they're attacking the patriotism of others.
Having been inside, I know that the insiders don't have it all right. They make mistakes, and indeed, it's more likely to be mistakes, and it's more likely to be misjudgment if there is no criticism.
It was Jefferson who said that our kind of government is not based on trust. It's based on, in fact, suspicion.
Supporting the Constitution, understanding what's in the Constitution, caring about the Constitution. That's why we don't have a king, because we have a piece of paper. So I think that is patriotism.
It's not just those of us who've been privileged to serve actually in the government who are the patriots. It's every citizen who respects and honors the fact that we have such a wonderful country.
To suggest that if you have a different viewpoint than any given administration, or if you're not supporting the president in policies that may be highly erroneous, I don't see that as patriotism at all. In fact, I would argue that any patriot with integrity is going to speak out if he or she feels that we're on the wrong course.
It's not unpatriotic to demand that Congress upholds its constitutional responsibilities regarding the declaration of war. It's not unpatriotic to be very upset, vocally upset, when Congress abrogates this constitutional responsibility by transferring war powers authority to the President of the United States, as they did in October 2002.
You guys asked about I was out in Iraq trying to get rid of Saddam and almost got killed for it. And besides, almost went to jail. So it doesn't take a whole lot of courage for me to fight against war, and I did at the beginning, but I was studiously ignored.
When we did the first Gulf War, when I came out of Baghdad in 1991, I met with the President of the United States, I met with the senior leadership of both parties. One thing that sticks with me to this day is the extent to which each one of them explained to me in very emotional terms the extent to which they had to plumb their consciences to come to a decision on how to vote on the use of force authorization. It had been a moral decision on their part. It had been one that had kept them up at night as they fought their way through this. We owe our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, and our Marines nothing less before we send them to battle.
Sometimes the true patriot takes the unpopular course, but helps their country avoid mistakes. And even if they can't persuade, at least they try.
For me, America is this amazing land of opportunity, of beauty, of idealism, hope. It is a beacon to the world. It's a place with fantastic people. And what infuriates me more than anything else is that this administration has systematically slandered, libeled, blackened the image of America to our friends and allies around the world.
Having the authority and the ability to go and wage war is a very, very simple thing, and it needs to be done with care and with deliberation and with genuine forethought. And I think that none of that was present in the lead-up to this entire debacle that we now call enduring freedom.
When the emperor has no clothes, you have to have the presence of mind and the courage to stand up and say, the emperor has no clothes.
Bye. All mine, bitch. Broken tight. Cute.
The war on terror is not confined strictly to the Al-Qaeda chasing. The war on terror involves Saddam Hussein.
The president said the war would make the world safer. But did the Bush administration know what it was really getting into?
The basic approach was that we didn't really foresee exactly what was needed, so we were going to wait
Thank
until
you.
Was the most dangerous threat.
Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
And were we told the truth?
The administration made statements which I can only describe as dishonest.
Tonight, frontline correspondent Martin Smith travels to Iraq to investigate truth, war, and consequences.
Four left, huh? Where are these fucking guys? There they are.
Just 2 weeks after the fall of Saddam. We accompanied Kanan Makia, an Iraqi exile who has been at the center of
Oh yeah! Yeah, bitch! I'm on fire, baby! Landed every hit! When it mattered.
Sometimes turned it into a desert.
Wish me luck. 9 kills, 3 left. Deja vu.
Convoys were busy moving in additional equipment and troops, while soldiers manned crude checkpoints.
Oh.
The roads are not secure. Bandits are a common hazard. We traveled in conflict with other returning Iraqi exiles.
Woo!
Kilometers to go. They paused for a picnic.
It's gonna be mine, isn't it? I think it is. Where is this asshole? I killed so many people right there. They shouldn't have ran out in front of me. They're fucking dumb. I landed those sniper hits though, didn't I? Real good, real good. Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Blasted by missiles.
Where is this guy?
Others were destroyed by fire. The capital of one of the world's biggest oil-producing nations was also suffering from years of UN sanctions, as well as underdevelopment and neglect at the hands of Saddam and his Ba'ath Party.
I suppose the shock was to realize just how run down the city had been allowed to become by the Ba'ath. I thought of the
Where
Ba'ath
is this
modernizing
fucking guy?
as an ugly, brutal, deformed kind of modernity, but modernizing nonetheless. And here I entered a city that was ramshackle, broken apart, buildings cracking at the seams, filthy, smelling, garbage on the streets. It was tragic. There was a true sense of dilapidation everywhere.
On top of the dilapidation came post-war looting.
When you take the lid off of a repressive system of 30 years in the making, and you don't have an alternative law and order system to replace it, the population went wild.
The looting had gone far beyond the stealing of furniture and air conditioners.
Where in the
Looters had
fuck's sake is this guy?
deconstructed
Where
entire
is he?
Stripped out wires, insulation, plumbing.
Fuck is this guy?
Stealing any reusable, resaleable materials. They torched what remained. When General J. Garner and his reconstruction team arrived, they found nearly all the buildings they needed to run post-war Iraq.
Yeah! Woo! I already got him. It was a bot. I was like, where the fuck is this guy? Yeah! Winning by default, bitch, without having to work for it. 9 kills. Good run. Yeah. Frames win games. Yeah. I got a pretty good headshot in this match. I want to go back and look at this match because they're often not usually this good. You kind of autoplay, and I don't really want you to do that. You're annoying. You are locked or something. Yep. There. So go back to YouTube and we'll see if there's anything new. Looking for something to watch. I guess Cloud couldn't make it today. I will get off of Fortnite. It's good, good to get a win. Good to keep in practice and stuff for when we do play. It was her idea. I did not ask her to do this. She was like, "We're gonna play Fortnite tonight." I was like, "Okay." and now, like. Alright, gonna play some other games. It was fun. I'll cook some silver. Planned Parenthood raid is probably pretty good.
This guy is financially racist because he tried to financially and legally
financially racist.
Me. He's a bad guy, and let me just say, if you ever get a letter from Bill Joyner, he says, "Hey, do you want some easy money? Don't worry about your credit. Run the other way. Don't call him back. Stay away."
Oh no, it's this guy talking about Bill Joyner again. Oh no.
Take his money because he'll try to take your home. That's what I'd recommend. That's who Bill Joyner is.
Hey, Kelly, how you
Bill
doing?
Joyner.
Hey, good, Andrew. How are you? Hey, you too. Good to see you.
Damn it, Bill Joyner.
Greetings.
Stop being a white man ripping up people for, like with real estate. Damn it. Stop. You can't tell a white man to not do real estate. How is a white man not going to do real estate? Come on. Let the white man real estate. Come on. Let the white man real estate. Come on. It's Bill Joyner. Come on. You know he probably lives in a nice house out there in the hills.
Don't know where are we and what are we doing today?
We're in Orange,
We're talking about Bill Joyner.
California. We're in front of Planned Parenthood.
Bill Joyner. Planned Parenthood.
We're here to save the babies. Not enough people know what's going
Oh,
on.
I thought it was about Bill Joyner.
3,000 babies in the United States are murdered and aborted every day. And I don't know if you saw the sign over here. Did you get a picture of the sign here where they're selling the baby parts? My understanding is they'll actually
The baby
rip off
parts.
the head and then start taking the organs off
Ugh.
one at a time so they can then sell.
I don't really want to hear this nut. I just don't really care. I don't care what he has to say. He's stupid from the get-go. It would waste precious minutes of my life. Oh no, revolution is coming. I don't want to hear that. That's scary. Well, I hope that they leave me alone. They probably won't. I'll probably be the first against the wall. That's usually what happens. What an attitude I have. But I mean, when I'm king, I know that I'll be first against the wall. Oh, I don't like this part. That's alright, though. It's acceptable. No thanks. Skip. Play. I'm in Argon Prime. I wish to buy a small miner high preset. Add to shopping list. Confirm order. Yeah, got a new ship. Thank you for reporting. Sounds good. Human Mastery Season 14. Yeah, the competitive. No, I don't want to play competitive. I want to play 6-man. Mystery Heroes Open Queue. Quick play. Oh. Play any role. No, wait. No. Custom games. They don't have 6v6. Oh, they got rid of 6v6, and that sucks. Let's just do all and just get a fast queue. I should learn a new character, but none of them really appeal to me anymore. Do I have all the characters now? Let's go in and... No, wait, no. I don't want a custom game. I just want to go to the practice range. We'll just see what other characters there are. Oh, I suppose I should bet on my bets. Oh, I got a queue? Okay. Damn it, Bill Joyner. I don't care about this WoW drama. Don't recommend this channel anymore. You're scaring me with this talk. You're like scaring me with this. Thank you, secular talk. Secular talk. What do you mean secular talk? No, I don't think so. Do devs know what gamers want? Oh yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you want me to tank? Okay, go.
Tim, today I want to talk about, do devs know what gamers want?
I just joined. Whatever.
Is a direct follow-up to my video tweet. Do gamers know what they like? Before I made that video,
that sounds fun.
I just mentioned I was going to do comments. And Lireg Mar said, personally, I think
I got hacked. I got hacked. I was
better
like, what?
And you know what? They're right. So both that video, so I made that video and then I made this one. Keep in mind, these were made not even that late. So I don't know what the comments were on that other one. Raw, unfiltered response to the Jeff know what he means. Here it is. No. No, we don't know what you want. We have no idea, seriously, what you want. I almost did this as a short. I was just going to do a short and go, you definitely know what games you want? Nope. And then cut it off. And you can stop here. If you want to know why it is, we're so absolutely confused about what it is you want. Keep watching. Because I know some of you are like, you should know what we want. We don't. Here's the longer answer. And it's all kind of can be summed up as because you don't know either. But you got to remember I'm saying the collective you. I wish English had the collective you. Southern English does. Y'all don't know.
What?
Let me dive into that. This is a deep dive on why y'all don't know, which is why we don't know what you do. First off, many of you are telling developers what you hate. Great. You said what it is you don't want, but what is it you want? I have an entire video on how to give good feedback, and I'll link it below. But I could just say, when you keep saying, I hate this in games, I hate this feature, I hate these kind of characters and all that. Great! What kind of characters do you want? If you hate sarcastic characters, guess what? There's an entire realm of sarcastic characters. But what is it you want? Characters, serious characters. Do you want characters with a lot of background? Do you want characters that with very little that you don't want to have a long time of long dialogue? What do you want? That's why you have to tell us what you want and not what you don't want. But wait, there's more. Even when you say what you want, you're often extraordinarily vague. You will say, I want a better game. I want a better UI. Yeah, I'll just slide the better slider from okay to great on all of these. I have an entire video on why developers need context to your feedback. That's never more true than when you give feedback. When you give, especially positive feedback, if you don't see what you're talking about, it can be really for example, what is better for you mean? Or when you say, how is that AI bad? What are you talking about? What are they not taking cover? Are they just running straight at you shooting? What do you mean? When you say you don't like a UI, what is the friction point in that UI that you're encountering? What is it that's bothering you? If you just say, that UI is dumb, it's not how it is. Trust me, it's not just gamers who do this. I've worked with people who literally said that out of their mouth. They're like, that looks dumb. Great, I'll get right on that. Sometimes though, and you know, I've talked about how some UI issues are really an underlying system mechanic issue. This comes up in the videos on encumbrance, where you can have a really good UI if your game supports encumbrance, but you take encumbrance out and suddenly that same UI is terrible because people can carry more. And suddenly there's a lot more things in their inventory, and the UI you were using for a limited inventory doesn't work for a UI with an unlimited inventory. So that's why you need to be very specific about what it is you didn't like. Do you really hate that UI? Or do you hate that you can vacuum up everything? Or do you want to be able to vacuum up everything, but you just wish the game would somehow organize it better? Be specific. Here's the one that really gets me, and that many of you refuse to acknowledge. You all, again, I wish English had a plural. You all do not agree on what a good feature is. Go back and watch both of my encumbrance videos. They're linked below. Or watch the video I had on fast travel, or even the video I did on providing game difficulty, different options in there. Read the comments on it, which I know a lot of you don't do, and you complain that YouTube doesn't do a good job of sorting them. Just pick one of those videos, set it to show all the comments, and scroll for a few minutes. You will find that some of you literally say you will not play a game that is lacking a particular feature, and then keep scrolling, and you'll find people who hate games that have that feature. And it can be anything. Fast travel, VO, walls of text, story mode. Some of you require it, and some of you skip games. And you have reasons for doing it. I'm not saying you're wrong. What I am saying is there's no possible way to make a game to make it better. What's interesting to me is this channel has been really acknowledged. You don't even agree on the fact that all of you are disagreeing. Some of you don't acknowledge there are any other games like this. There was a video I did where I said people frequently want better graphics. A lot of you asked for better graphics. And someone said, and I quote, "No one asked for better graphics." I guess you never read a review and you don't go on forum boards. Because yes, they do. And keep in mind, better graphics. Sometimes they're just talking about higher resolution. They bought a 4K monitor and they're upset for not getting 4K. Sometimes they want a farther reception. Or that there's always things blocking the view. Sometimes they just need more creature variety or more location variety. These are all better graphics. These are all things that require a lot more art time, a lot more things to be loaded in, a lot better optimization of your engine. These are all going into the category of better graphics. And all of you, I guarantee, have asked for some form of better graphics at some point when you're responding to a question of what did you like in this. Now keep in mind too, sometimes you guys talk about art style, but everything I just mentioned, even if the art style stays the same, you will need more polys, more textures, and more everything, just to give you more creature variety. All that it is better graphics, but means more work, more artists, more time, more money. And many of you say, well, I don't really care about graphics. I'm one of you. Graphics have never been high on my list of what I care about in a game, but many, many, many players are attracted to a game by its pretty graphics, even if they say afterwards, pretty graphics open the door. I've told some designers on me, sometimes it's temptation. Your head may be turned by the prettiness, but you stay because of the personality and chemistry. So it's like that with games. In a pretty game, people will at least get their eyeballs on it. Then they're safe because of the mechanics. And then later on, they'll deny ever even looking at their game. One of the things I want to point out is many of you argue against things that would make a game that you can try to apply. And I talked about how designed by Skycatlive. I agree. Usually that leads to making a game that's so bland and vanilla that no one can really have an argument against it, but nobody really feels like playing it. What I mean by that is that you literally have argued that games should have fewer game options. I'm not even talking about game difficulty, just fewer game options. I have a video on game options. Again, read those comments. Many of you are going, yeah, I hate the game that lot. I don't know what to say. The designer does. Why is it that can be they didn't have a strong vision? Ignore the fact that many of those options are there to let more people play the game. I'm colorblind. That's a disability. There are games I literally cannot play because they have puzzles or information that I'm supposed to pick up on. That's color-based, but there are no colorblind options. The worst one would be the one that's going to say in front of me. And then later I'm playing the game and I realize I'm playing it wrong before I become a puzzle that I literally cannot solve. And there's no option. Don't suffer. I get that it's you. This is what you, the individual, want. You have to realize that you, the individual, are not very good at giving developers feedback, and that you, the individual, are not everybody the game's going to use. Many of you aren't even in the majority. I hear you. I don't think I'm in the majority. I like a lot of niche games. I've made a lot of niche games. And so that's kind of what I'm saying here is game development is hard on its own, technically. But this lack of consensus among game players, take that. It's that much harder to make a game that you want to have a lot of fun. Because most of you don't know what you want. Those of you who know what you want are very vague and expressive. And many of you don't realize what you want. This is why, for most of my career, I just made what I want, what I like. I hoped other people would like it, but it was me and the team just trying to make something we liked, make each other laugh, make each other fun. And we were like, gee, I hope people like this. We weren't sure. We didn't care. Marketing would ask us questions like, what's the demographics for your game? We didn't know. We didn't have an answer, and we didn't care. We're like, I don't know. Why don't you go home and play the game? Many of you like my earlier game. Maybe it's because I did make it back from that thought. However, I can tell you, my later games sold more copies. So, what's the right path? I don't know. But I can tell you this. Do game developers know what game players want? No, we don't. How much in time money does it cost to make a model? Usually players just think that releasing the dev tool is enough, but it isn't. When is it viable to think of allowing easy to mod even something like custom maps or sprites in the model? How much do you lose when it changes scope to allow for players to I'm going to talk about this. I can't go into specific costs. It varies by making RPG or platformer. Is it just one solo dev? So I will talk about what we're doing. But the reason there's so many game players out there that think along this line. Why don't they just make it moddable? All they have to do is, and then it's something like, duh. Let me just tell you, the answer to this is so many questions that you don't have time to do that for money. You don't. It is not as easy to make it as moddable as you say. Whenever anyone says, just do this, my immediate gut reaction is, they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Frequently this is, from a manager, hey Tim, why don't you just do this? Because that would just take this long, which would just cost you money. You want me to just do that? That kind of thing. And I'm like, no, can't you just do this right now? And I'm like, nope. And then we talk about why it would take that long. Which I do have a reason for saying why it's not just me going, it takes 2 weeks because I don't feel like doing it, which I've run into. So first we're talking about what it takes to make a game. Let me caveat this. It helps to do this in the very beginning. When you first start designing a game, before you lay down a single line of code, you really want to have decided how the game's modeled and how you're going to make it. It's retroactively versus is really hard. And by hard I mean time, and by time I mean money. You will be rewriting things that already work. You will be rewriting code that already works flawlessly just so they offload through a choke point so that you can check for modifications and hard. At the very highest level, there are 3 stages to making the game. They are making the system exposing, and then exposing, and then making the resulting exposed part changeable and preferably easy to change by a mod. Although that latter part is good job. As long as it's exposed, they can get at it. At some point, your job is done. Anything you do to make it easy to modify it nice and pleasant and big modification. It may not be the goal of your game. Keep in mind, every time you write a game, you have a goal. And is one of your goals is modifability. If it's not, modifability is the goal required. So let's talk about those 3 stages. One is the first one, making systems. either have a method that uses data and you expose that data, or the method itself is kind of functional.
Great game, guys.
Where the method uses data, it means you have some kind of way of calculating something that uses parameters, values, and those values are read in somewhere, and you could therefore ultimately down the line it could be modelable by players. An example of this would be weight of items. You can make the weight of any item exposed. It's somewhere in a data file. So when
I
items
mitigated
are being read
15K
in,
of their
part
damage.
Their data is how much they weigh. This means if you, the player, are playing this game and go, I wish ammo was weightless, you could solve that by finding where that data is and just setting all the weights of ammo to 0. Contrast this with the second method, which is the entire method itself is exposed. This is, it could be function or method. I'll just pick one, and I'm just going to call it a method. You expose that. So in this case, there's an encumbrance calculation somewhere, and the player in a mod can override the calculation, the entire calculation, not just parameters, which means instead of making ammo items have a weight of 0, you just skip them when calculating encumbrance. The encumbrance method no longer looks at ammo. They both do the same thing in that case, but the latter method of exposing all the methods in the game is way more powerful because you can actually change on the fly. Let's say you wanted ammo to, certain kinds of ammo to weigh double, or you wanted it to only make ammo count if you're playing on hard mode. Really hard to do that with the data method. Very easy to do that with the method. Okay, so that's stage 1. You've decided to make your systems exposable. So stage 2 is exposing them. How do you actually expose them? If it's parameter data, it's pretty easy. They're in files that get read in. So now those files exist somewhere, and we're talking about stage 3. How does the player actually get hold of it? The method 1 is harder depending on your engine. And this is another reason I can't go into much detail on this, because depending on what engine you're using, putting in overrides are very different. So let me talk about what I did in Arcanum, and I will link that below. In Arcanum, for any system, there were 2 places where I checked to see if there was a script over. When you were asking me, can I do this? And then do this. So, for example, for items, can I pick it up? Pick it up. Can I wield it? Wield it. Can I take it off? Take it off. Can I drop it? Drop it. There are a ton of other ones too. There are, can the player be seen by this creature? They see them. Can they go into combat with the player? Start combat with the player. The reason you have that way is the override on the can lets you override the game and say they can't take this item. Like let me make an item in like 4 seconds. Boom. That sword cannot be picked up at all by them. Let's say you want to say if an orc picks it up, they take damage. Then on the pickup, you override and say, so you let them pick it up, and when they pick it up, you're like, you're an orc, take some damage. On the can see in combat, you may say something like, I want to make a ring of invisibility. No one can see through it. It's an artifact level invisibility. So even see invisible spells won't see it. You just put on the can see function, are they wearing this, the player wearing this? Can't be seen. And that will override everything else. You may also want NPC to do something special when combat starts. Everyone, come to me, we're attacking. You can do that easily by on the combat start. Say it. This makes it very easy for people to do all of it. But with something when we made these, we had to make sure.
For fuck's sake, we needed kills, man. I've got more than double what both DPS have. I have double what both DPS have combined. Ooh. Ooh. Please kill him. He's so low. Please kill him. You're so bad at this. Fucking annoying. Hold on. Stay on target. Stay on target. Ooh. What? Oh my god. What? What? I just popped to my ship. It's too hot in here for some reason. Hey, I got a DPS queue. Yay, 1 in 20. Maybe I'll go May. Penguin May. Ouchies. Quite fun.
Can they do this? It means every layer of an item had to go through a single choke point code to check the script. And then every way of picking it up had to go through another choke point so that
Oh, what happened here?
if it
My tablet
overrode
stopped.
the pickup function, everybody used the override. Not super hard if you haven't written a line of code, potentially very difficult if you've written a lot of code. And that brings me to this third step, which is, now that you've exposed all that stuff, how do you make that exposed part changeable? If it's data and files, you have to make sure those files can be edited by the player, and then the edited files take priority over whatever's in your database file. Somehow this has to, because that data has to get connected back in and has to take precedence over what was there. Preferably, you also let the player bundle all these files. If they make a bunch of different files and they want to put it into a mod, you give them a way to bundle it into that mod. So when they want to deliver their mod, they're like, here is a file that you drop into your mod folder, and now we'll override all this other stuff. Now, hopefully these use all the same tools that your developers used. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. I've used a number of tools at different companies that assume they're on the network of the company, the internal network, so they can do things like check files in Perforce, check status of things, put bugs into Jira. So they're interconnected with a lot of other things. Maybe they can be made standalone, or maybe you make a different set of tools for home use. Again, that would take time and that cost. One thing to bear in mind, once a player mods in a game, they have to be able to test it. That's a whole other thing. That depends on the engine. A moddable game may crash, and you may not be able to do it without it. Maybe the off-the-shelf engine you're using doesn't handle bad data well. It also may depend on tools. Like if they want to mod something that you're letting them override a C# script with another C# script, it may need to be compiled. So the end user may need to have a C# compiled. Maybe not. You also want to think about the kind of error messages you want or even can produce for mods. Like I said, if there's an error, some of the games have had inserted into Jira and said, hey, this game just crashed. Here's the stat. You can't do that for a mod. They won't have one. So you may need to use error messages for mods. Again, more time, more money. And just as a side note, I've worked on several games where an error message said something like this: illegal script code, see Dave. And we just knew what it meant. Because you shouldn't ever be able to have a bad script opcode in there. So if you ever saw one, that's why. That's not the so you should go see Dave. Probably something was wrong with the tool, or somebody made a change to an enumeration in code. Keep it aligned with something else. There were also a lot of cases where I've worked on a game where an artist could and did crash the game by checking in a bad model or a bad texture. Bulletproofing all of that takes a lot of time, which means a lot of money. It also slows the game down. You always check. So many of my games, after we went from our debug game to our release prototype, we turned all those checks off to gain speed. Usually loading speed, but sometimes running speed. Guess what? Are you going to leave those mod checks in, or are you going to make a special parameter? Like, you can run the game in mod test mode and those checks are re-enabled. Again, time, money, and you now have to explain this to modders. I assume you have someone who's writing some documentation. In addition, just adding some me that models may need, like a certain model, they require certain animations, certain labels, certain data. How you put a creature in, there has to be a way for it to walk around, or Is it flying only, and is that labeled flying? Does the game know what flying is? And what kind of combat attacks does it have? And where's that data kept? Is it kept on the creature? Is it kept somewhere else? All this stuff has to be done. Textures usually have to be a certain size. It used to be they had to be a power of 2, or boom. Now they don't have to be, but potentially it's way less efficient. So all that is documentation that you might have internal that may not be appropriate to externalize. Some will be, some won't. The ones that aren't have to be written. Time and also, I've already mentioned, modability depends on your engine. Unity, Unreal, and all the others. They handle modding differently. Some allow you to handle it differently yourself, even on the same engine. So you have decisions to make. Decisions means time. Time means money. For a game with a fixed time and budget, adding modability then means you add features. I talk about this in my video for design. If you put in something, you may have to not put in something else. Just because you're on the time to go, and your time is fixed, and your budget is fixed. So you have to think. In fact, for all of this, I just want to say, think about it carefully. Adding modability is not a no-brainer. And anybody who claims otherwise is inexperienced or trying to talk you into doing something that they want. I don't want to say they're lying, but they're basically trying to make you something. So just remember, if you want to add modability, you need those 3 stages. You need to make systems exposable, expose them, and then make the result of exposed data something to modify. So I hope this answered your question. Pelicano, 1987. Hi everyone, Tim. Today I want to talk about enemy AI. And this is to answer a question from Driver3899 who asked, any chance you could talk a little bit about how you approach thinking about enemy AI?
Thank you, Moconomy. I'd like to sub to your channel. Thank you, Timothy Kane. I'd like to sub to your channel. I'll go back in a second. What?
We were saying how very important it is to bring about in the human mind the radical revolution. Cannot anymore accept the world is now, with all the misery, conflict, destructive humanity, threats, and so on. Man is filled with war. Is filled with violence.
What?
And he has built a society along these lines.
Directed by, conditioned upon. There seems to be no system is taken for granted and misunderstood as the monetary system. Taking on nearly religious proportions, the established monetary institution exists as one of the most unquestioned forms of daily affairs. How money is created, the policies by which it is governed, and how it truly affects society. Of the planet's wealth, in a world where 34,000 children die every single day of poverty and preventable diseases, and where 50% of the world's population lives and whether we are aware of it or not, that blood in all of our established institutions and thus society itself is money. Therefore, understanding this institution is critical to understanding why our lives are the way they are. Unfortunately, economics is often viewed with confusion and endless streams of financial jargon coupled with intimidating mathematics quickly deters people from attempts at understanding it. However, the fact is, the complexity associated with the financial system is a mere mask, designed to conceal one of the most socially paralyzing structures humanity has ever endured. Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document titled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation.
You let him have it anyways? You let him have it anyways, you idiots. Why did you get off point?
On the opening page,
why did you get off point? You're dumb.
Various banking terminology. A translation goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The The Fed replies saying, sure, we'll buy this security from the government's bonds. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the set. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt. And when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made, and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10%, or $1 billion, is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans for the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction. In other words, the $9 billion created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and then 90% of the $9 billion is now available to be created. And of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion to 6.5 billion, 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion will be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other words, every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount is created in infinity.
Money as the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The the money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. Irrespective of demand for goods and services, and as supply and demand this is This is generally referred to as
what is the advice that you generally get? And that is inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat people who are saving. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this. How worse can we expect to solve the problems of inflation? That is, the increase in the supply of money with more inflation.
Of course, it can. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflation. But the act of expanding the money without there being services in the economy will always debase a currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the U.S. dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively. The inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence. Now, this reality seems absurd, economically acceptable. Hold that thought for absurdity and regard our financial system really operates. For our financial system, money, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation.
Ooh.
In fact, the last time in American history the national debt was completely paid off was in 1835. President Andrew Jackson shut down the central bank that preceded the Federal Reserve. In fact, Jackson's entire political platform essentially revolved around his commitment to shut down the central bank.
What?
The bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it. Unfortunately, his message was short-lived, and the international bankers succeeded to install another central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve. And as long as this institution exists,
What?
Original value, in turn debasing the existing money supply, raising prices in society. And since all this money is created out of debt and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pull enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living. One thing we've omitted from this equation.
Well, at least I trade.
Structure the application of interest. When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks, money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody. Such a default inevitable due to the fractionalization of practice. Also, the money that the bank foreclosure of his home by the bank, which provided the loan to purchase it. His argument was that the mortgage contract required both parties, being he and the bank, each put up a legitimate form of property for the exchange. In legal language, this is called consideration. Mr. Daly explained that the money was, in fact, not the property of the bank, for it was created out of nothing as soon as the loan agreement was signed. Remember what modern money mechanics stated about loans? What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits. Reserves are unchanged by the loan transactions, but deposit credits constitute new additions to the total deposits of the banking system. In other words, the money doesn't come out of their existing assets. The bank is simply inventing it, putting up nothing of its own, except for a theoretical liability on paper. As the court case progressed, the bank's president, Mr. Morgan, took the stand, and in the judge's personal memorandum, he recalled that the plaintiff, bank's president, admitted that, in combination with the Federal Reserve Bank, did create the money and credit upon its books by bookkeeping entry. The money and credit first came into existence when they created it. Mr. Morgan admitted that no United States law or statute existed which gave him the right to do this. A lawful consideration must exist and be tendered to support the note.
Yep. I'll be right back. Gonna get something to eat. Okay, we're gonna have some kimchi rice and some hummus.
The jury found that there was no lawful consideration, and I agree. He also poetically added, only God can create something of value out of nothing. And upon this revelation, the court rejected the bank's claim for foreclosure, and Daly kept his home. The implications of this court decision are immense. For every time you borrow money from a bank, whether it is a mortgage loan or a credit card charge, the money given to you is not only counterfeit, it is an illegitimate form of consideration, and hence voids the contract to repay, for the bank never had the money as property to begin with. Unfortunately, such legal realizations are suppressed and ignored, and the game of perpetual wealth transfer and perpetual debt continues. And this brings us